The stagecoach wasn't supposed to arrive that Christmas Eve, not through the blizzard, not when every sensible soul had taken shelter. But there it was, rolling into Pine Creek like a ghost from another world. And when she stepped down into the snow, golden hair catching the lamplight, Graham Lark felt something crack inside his chest, something he'd buried 6 years ago with his father. He didn't know it yet, but the woman in the Eastern dress would shatter every wall he'd built. This is their story. Stay until the end and comment your city so I can see how far this tale has traveled. The wind cut through Pine Creek like a blade, sharp enough to make a man question every choice that had brought him to this godforsaken corner of Montana territory. Graham Lark stood on the boardwalk outside Murphy's saloon, his collar turned up against the Christmas Eve blizzard, watching the street disappear under fresh powder. At 25, he'd already lived enough winters to know this one was meaner than most. The kind that killed cattle, snapped fence posts, and reminded a man just how small he was against the vastness of the West. Behind him, the saloon glowed warm and raucous, fiddle music bleeding through the gaps in the doorframe, men's laughter mixing with the clink of glasses and the occasional crash of furniture when someone had too much Christmas cheer and not enough sense. Graham had stopped in for a single whiskey, just enough to take the edge off before riding back to the Circle L ranch. Alone. The way he preferred it. The way it had to be. He pulled his hat lower and started toward his horse when he heard it. The distant jangle of harness bells, faint at first, then growing louder. Impossible. The stage from Helena wasn't due for another 3 days, and no driver with half a brain would attempt Broken Ridge Pass in this weather. Yet there it came, emerging from the white curtain of snow like something out of a fever dream, 4 horses straining against their traces, the coach lurching and sliding on the frozen ruts. Graham wasn't the only one who'd noticed. Up and down the street, doors opened. Men stepped out, shaking their heads in disbelief. Old Pete from the telegraph office cupped his hands around his mouth and hollered, "That's Higgins! Crazy son of a bitch actually made it!" The stage rolled to a stop in front of the Timber Creek Hotel, and for a moment everything hung suspended. The snow, the music, the breath in Graham's lungs. Then the door swung open, and time started moving again, but differently somehow, like the world had shifted half a degree off its axis. The first person to emerge was a man in his 50s, solid and businesslike, with silver threading through his dark beard. He moved like someone accustomed to authority, careful but confident as he navigated the coach's steps. But Graham barely registered him, because behind him, stepping down into the swirling snow with one gloved hand gripping the doorframe, was a woman who didn't belong in Montana any more than a diamond belonged in a coal bucket. She was young, early 20s, he'd guess, with golden hair pinned up beneath a velvet traveling hat that probably cost more than most folks in Pine Creek made in a month. Her dress was deep green, tailored, and Eastern, with brass buttons that caught the lamplight spilling from the hotel windows. Everything about her screamed money, breeding, refinement. Everything about her said she'd stepped off the stage and into the wrong century. But it was her face that stopped Graham cold. Even from across the street, even through the falling snow, he could see the fine lines of her features, the determined set of her jaw, the intelligence in her eyes as they swept across the town, taking measure. She wasn't pretty in the fragile way of porcelain dolls. She was beautiful in the way of something wild that had been temporarily caged, something that still remembered what freedom tasted like. Their eyes met. It lasted no more than 3 seconds, maybe 4. But in that span, Graham felt the full weight of her gaze, curious, assessing, unafraid. Something in his chest lurched, a sensation he hadn't experienced since he was 19 years old, and stupid enough to believe in things like fate and future, and the possibility that another person could fill the empty spaces inside you. He turned away first, cursing under his breath. "Quite a sight, ain't she?" The voice belonged to Tom Murphy, who'd stepped out of his saloon to watch the commotion. He was grinning, tobacco stains yellowing his teeth. "Eastern quality, that one. You can smell the money from here." Graham grunted non-committally and started toward his horse again. "That's Evelyn Hart," Murphy continued, undeterred by Graham's silence. The man had a gift for knowing everyone's business before they knew it themselves. Traveling with her uncle, Wallace Hart. He's some kind of timber investor from Philadelphia. Word is they're here to look at the northern tracks, maybe buy up some land. "Good for them," Graham said flatly. He untied his horse's reins from the hitching post, his fingers clumsy in the cold. Heard they're staying through the new year. Shame you're such a hermit, Lark. Woman like that might what? Graham turned, and something in his expression made Murphy take a half step back. Might want to waste her time on a dirt-poor rancher? Might stick around long enough to see what Montana winters do to delicate eastern flowers? He swung up into the saddle, the leather creaking beneath him. She'll be gone before the week's out. They always are. He didn't wait for Murphy's reply. He urged his horse forward, past the hotel, past the warm glow of the windows where he could see the hearts being greeted by Gerald Foster, the hotel owner, past the false promise of Christmas cheer and human connection. Back toward the 6 miles of frozen trail that separated him from the Circle L, from the empty house his father had built, from the life he'd constructed out of necessity and stubbornness and the determination never to need anyone again. The wind howled across the open country, and Graham welcomed it. Cold was honest. Cold didn't pretend to be something it wasn't. Cold didn't make promises it couldn't keep. But as his horse picked its way through the drifts, he couldn't shake the image of golden hair catching lamplight, of eyes that had seen straight through him in the space of a heartbeat. By the time he reached the ranch, his beard was crusted with ice, and he'd convinced himself he was being a fool. She was just a woman, a pampered, privileged woman who'd be on the first stage out of Pine Creek the moment she realized what the West really was. Not some romantic adventure from a dime novel, but a grinding test of endurance that broke the weak and hardened the strong into something barely human. The Circle L sat in a shallow valley, protected on 3 sides by ponderosa pines that his father had refused to cut. The ranch house was solid but spare, 2 rooms and a loft, built to withstand weather, not impress visitors. The barn was larger and in better repair. Priorities. Out here, animals mattered more than comfort. Graham stabled his horse, forked out hay, checked the dozen head of cattle huddled in the lee of the barn. Then he walked through the snow to the dark house, his boots the only sound in the vast silence. Inside, he lit a single lamp and built up the fire, his movements automatic from 6 years of practice. The room was clean but austere. A table, 2 chairs, a shelf of books his mother had loved and his father had tolerated. No decorations, no wreath on the door, no acknowledgement that tomorrow was anything but another day closer to spring. Christmas had died the year his father did. Graham poured himself a generous whiskey and sat at the table staring at the fire. Outside, the wind tested the walls, seeking weaknesses. Finding none, it moved on, disappointed. He thought about the woman, Evelyn, Murphy had called her, and felt a flicker of something dangerous, curiosity maybe, or worse, interest. He crushed it ruthlessly. He'd learned his lesson about beautiful things that didn't belong in Montana. His mother had been one, a school teacher from Boston who'd fallen in love with his father's promises of adventure and wide-open spaces. She'd lasted 8 years before the loneliness and the cold and the endless work had worn her down to nothing. He'd been 12 when she died, old enough to understand that love wasn't enough, that wanting something badly didn't make it possible. His father had changed after that, became harder, more remote. The land takes everything eventually, he'd told Graham once, drunk on Christmas Eve, staring into a fire much like this one. Your mother, your dreams, your softness. If you're smart, you'll stop fighting it, let it take what it wants and protect what's left. Graham had thought he understood. Then 6 years ago, his father had gone out to check on the herd during a January blizzard and hadn't come back. They'd found him 3 days later, frozen solid, 100 yards from the barn. He'd gotten turned around in the whiteout, died within shouting distance of home. After that, Graham had stopped pretending the West was anything but a beautiful, merciless enemy. He'd rebuilt the herd, repaired the fences, kept the ranch running through sheer stubbornness. He'd stopped going to town except when necessary. He'd stopped letting people get close. He'd stopped believing in Christmas miracles or second chances, or the idea that another person could be anything but a liability in a place where weakness meant death. It had worked. He'd survived. He'd even prospered, in his own small way. The Circle L wouldn't make anyone rich, but it was his, free and clear, and he owed nothing to any man. The price was loneliness so complete it had become a kind of companion, reliable in its constancy. Graham finished his whiskey and went to bed, expecting to forget Evelyn Hart by morning. He didn't. Christmas morning dawned clear and cold. The kind of day that made the snow sparkle like crushed diamonds and hurt your eyes to look at too long. Graham was mending tack in the barn when he heard the sound of hoofbeats crunching through the snow. He tensed. Visitors were rare, and rarely good news, then relaxed slightly when he recognized Sheriff Bill Dawson's gray gelding. The sheriff was a good man, fair and competent, one of the few people in Pine Creek Graham respected, but his arrival on Christmas morning could only mean trouble. "Morning, Graham." Dawson dismounted stiffly, his breath fogging in the frigid air. "Merry Christmas." "Bill?" Graham set aside the bridle he'd been working on. "What brings you out?" "A favor to ask, actually." Dawson stomped his feet, trying to restore circulation. "You know those timber investors who came in last night?" Graham's hands stilled. "I saw them. Wallace Hart and his niece. They need someone to guide them up to the northern tracks. Hart wants to see the land before he commits to buying. Problem is, Higgins, the stage driver, is laid up with a fever. Doctor says it's not serious, but he's in no shape to make the trip, and nobody else in town knows those trails like you do. There's plenty of men who could—" "No." Dawson's voice was firm. "There's men who think they know the backcountry, and there's you. The difference matters when you're talking about a 2-day trip into the high country with a storm possibly coming in. Hart's offering good money, and frankly, Graham, I'd sleep better knowing someone competent was looking after them." Graham wanted to refuse. Every instinct screamed at him to send Dawson back to town empty-handed, but the sheriff had helped him more than once over the years, had looked the other way when Graham's grief had manifested in ways that weren't strictly legal. He owed the man. "Just Hart?" he asked. Dawson had the grace to look uncomfortable. "His niece insists on coming, said she didn't travel all the way from Philadelphia to sit in a hotel room while her uncle conducts business." "Of course she did." Graham closed his eyes briefly, then nodded. "Tell them we leave at first light tomorrow. They'll need to dress warm. This isn't a Sunday carriage ride." "I'll let them know. Thank you, Graham. I mean it." After Dawson left, Graham stood in the barn doorway, watching the sheriff's tracks disappear around the bend in the trail. He had a bad feeling about this, a premonition that taking Evelyn Hart into the wilderness was going to change something fundamental, break something that couldn't be repaired. But a promise was a promise. He spent the rest of Christmas Day preparing, checking his rifles, packing supplies, mapping the route in his mind. The northern tracks were beautiful but remote, accessible only by a narrow trail that skirted Broken Ridge and climbed through dense pine forest before opening into a high valley where his grandfather had once considered homesteading. The timber up there was old growth, massive ponderosas worth a fortune to the right buyer. It would be a hard ride, especially for someone unused to western trails, but they could make it in a day if they started early and pushed hard. That night, as Graham lay in bed listening to the wind, he let himself wonder what it would be like, spending 2 days with a woman who probably thought Montana was all cowboys and Indians, who'd never known real cold or real hunger or real fear. She'd complain, most likely, ask too many questions, slow them down. But there was a part of him, a part he'd thought he'd killed years ago, that was curious. What had brought her west? What did she see when she looked at this harsh, unforgiving country? And why did the memory of her gaze make his chest ache with something that felt dangerously like hope? He crushed the feeling, rolled over, and forced himself to sleep. Tomorrow would come soon enough. Graham rode into Pine Creek just as the sun was coloring the sky pink and gold behind the mountains. The town was quiet, most folks still sleeping off Christmas celebrations. Only the hotel showed signs of life, smoke rising from the chimney, lamplight in the windows. He tied his horse to the rail and was about to knock when the door opened and Wallace Hart stepped out, dressed in expensive traveling clothes that wouldn't last a day in the backcountry. He was a big man, probably imposing in a Philadelphia boardroom, but here he just looked out of place. "Mr. Lark, I presume?" Hart extended a hand, his grip firm and businesslike. "Wallace Hart, I appreciate you agreeing to guide us on short notice. Sheriff Dawson said you needed help." Graham shook briefly and released. "If we're going to make this work, you'll need different clothes. What you're wearing won't—" "Uncle Wallace, I found the—" The voice came from inside the hotel, and then she appeared in the doorway, and Graham's carefully maintained composure cracked. Evelyn Hart was dressed in men's clothes, canvas trousers, a heavy wool shirt, sturdy boots. Someone, probably the hotel owner's wife, had outfitted her properly. Her golden hair was braided and pinned up under a wide-brimmed hat. She looked practical, capable, and more beautiful than she had any right to be. Her eyes found his, and for the second time, Graham felt that jolt of recognition, of something clicking into place that shouldn't click, that couldn't click, because he'd sworn off this kind of foolishness years ago. "You're our guide." It wasn't a question. She studied him with the same direct assessing gaze she'd used on the town. "I'm Evelyn Hart." "Graham Lark." He touched the brim of his hat, a gesture automatic from childhood manners his mother had drilled into him. "This isn't going to be an easy ride, Miss Hart. The trail's rough, and we'll be camping overnight. If you'd prefer to stay in town, I wouldn't—" Her chin lifted slightly, a gesture of determination he recognized because he'd seen it in his own mirror often enough. "I didn't come to Montana to sit in parlors, Mr. Lark." Wallace Hart chuckled. "You'll find my niece has a stubborn streak, Mr. Lark. Comes from her father's side of the family." "Stubbornness keeps you alive out here," Graham said, still holding Evelyn's gaze. "But so does knowing when to admit you're in over your head." "Then I suppose we'll find out which applies." Her voice was level, but he caught a flash of something in her eyes. Annoyance, maybe, or the spark of a challenge accepted. Against his better judgment, Graham felt his mouth twitch towards something that might have been a smile if he'd remembered how. "I suppose we will. We need to get moving if we want to make camp before dark." "Can you ride?" "I've been riding since I was 6 years old." "English saddle?" "Does it matter?" "Western saddle's different. Heavier. Built for long days and rough terrain, not jumping fences in a paddock." "Then I'll learn." She moved past him toward where the horses waited, and he caught a scent of something floral, lavender maybe, or rosewater, that had no business in a Montana winter. The ride started in silence, single file on the narrow trail that led north out of Pine Creek. Graham took point, Wallace Hart in the middle, and Evelyn bringing up the rear. The first hour was easy, following the creek bottom where the snow wasn't too deep and the horses could find their footing. Graham kept them at a steady walk, letting the Harts adjust to the saddles, the altitude, the reality of what they'd signed up for. He glanced back periodically, checking their progress. Wallace seemed capable enough, though his city softness showed in the way he sat too stiffly, fighting the horse's rhythm instead of moving with it. But Evelyn surprised him. She'd settled into the saddle naturally, her body already learning the different balance, her hands light on the reins. When they stopped to water the horses at a tributary, Graham finally broke the silence. "We'll reach Broken Ridge Pass by midday. That's where it gets steep. Stay close, and if your horse acts nervous, don't fight it. They can sense rockfall better than we can." "Have you lost many clients to rockfall, Mr. Lark?" Evelyn asked, dismounting with only a slight stumble. "I don't have clients, Miss Hart. I have a ranch. This is a favor to the sheriff." "A favor that comes with payment, I understand." "Money's money." He refilled his canteen from the stream, the water so cold it made his teeth ache. "Doesn't mean I have to like playing nursemaid to tourists." Her eyes flashed. "We're hardly—" "Evelyn." Wallace's voice carried a warning. He turned to Graham with a placating smile. "You'll have to forgive my niece, Mr. Lark. She spent too much time in my brother's business offices, learning to speak her mind. Sometimes she forgets the frontier has different courtesies." "The frontier doesn't have courtesies," Graham said bluntly. "It has survival. You speak plain, you act fast, and you don't waste time on pretty words when pretty words don't change facts." He caught Evelyn's gaze. "Your uncle's right. You are tourists. Nothing wrong with that, but let's not pretend otherwise. I'll get you to the timber tracks and back safely if you follow my lead. That's the deal." For a moment he thought she might argue. Then, surprisingly, she laughed, a genuine sound that transformed her face from beautiful to luminous. "You're right. We are tourists, and you're doing us a favor we don't properly appreciate." She extended her hand. "Truce?" Graham looked at her outstretched hand, at the fine bones visible through her glove, at the smile that was somehow both apologetic and challenging. Against every bit of common sense he possessed, he shook it. "Truce." Her grip was firmer than he'd expected, and she held on a fraction longer than necessary, her eyes searching his face for something he couldn't name and wasn't sure he wanted her to find. They remounted and continued climbing. By the time they reached Broken Ridge Pass, the temperature had dropped and clouds were gathering to the west, heavy, dark formations that promised snow before nightfall. Graham studied them with a practiced eye, calculating odds and distances. They could push on to the timber tracks, but then they'd be caught in the high country when the storm hit. Better to make camp early, wait it out in shelter. The decision made, he led them off the main trail toward a spot he'd used before, a small clearing protected by a rock overhang with a natural windbreak and enough deadfall for a proper fire. They reached it just as the first flakes began to drift down. "We're stopping?" Wallace looked around, clearly hoping for something more substantial than rock and trees. "I thought we'd reach the timber tracks today. Storm's coming in faster than expected. We camp here, ride out tomorrow if it clears." Graham dismounted and started unpacking. "Help me gather firewood before it gets dark. Miss Hart, there's a deadfall pine about 30 yards that way. Break off the smaller branches, the dry ones." She didn't question, just headed in the direction he'd indicated. Wallace helped Graham set up a lean-to using pine boughs and canvas, their breath fogging as they worked. By the time Evelyn returned with an armload of wood, Graham had a fire pit dug and lined with rocks. He'd built hundreds of campfires in his life, but having an audience made him self-conscious. He could feel Evelyn watching as he arranged the kindling, struck flint to steel, coaxed the first flames to life. The fire caught and grew, pushing back the darkness and the cold, creating a small circle of warmth and light in the vast wilderness. "You make it look easy," she said softly, holding her hands out to the heat. "Practice." He set up the coffee pot, measured grounds from a tin. "Out here, fire's the difference between alive and dead." "Is everything life or death to you, Mr. Lark?" He glanced up, caught off guard by the question. In the firelight, her face was softer, more vulnerable than the determined woman who'd faced him down in Pine Creek. "In Montana?" "Usually, yes." Wallace had wandered off to tend to the horses, leaving them alone in the fire's glow. Snow was falling steadily now, hissing when flakes landed in the flames. Evelyn pulled her coat tighter and sat on a log Graham had dragged near the fire. "You don't think much of us, do you?" Her voice was curious, not accusatory. "City people coming west, playing at frontier life." Graham poured coffee into a tin cup, handed it to her. "I think you don't understand what you're playing at. This," he gestured at the darkness beyond their small circle of light, "this will kill you if you give it half a chance. It doesn't care about your money or your education or your good intentions. It just is, and you either adapt or you die. And you've adapted. I was born here. Different thing." She sipped the coffee, made a face at its bitterness, but kept drinking. "Tell me about your ranch." "Not much to tell. Cattle, horses, 6 square miles of land that's trying to kill me every winter. Yet you stay. Where else would I go?" The question came out harsher than he'd intended. He busied himself with the coffee pot, pouring his own cup. "The Circle L is mine. Only thing in this world, that is." "That sounds lonely." "Loneliness doesn't kill you. Dependency does." The words hung between them, stark and revealing. He'd said too much, exposed too much. He turned away, checking the horses, giving himself an excuse to leave the fire's intimacy. But her voice followed him into the darkness. "What happened to make you think that?" He didn't answer, couldn't answer, because to answer would be to excavate the graves of his parents, to revisit the Christmas Eves of his childhood when his mother had tried to make their rough cabin feel like a home, to remember his father's slow dissolution after she'd died, to relive the moment he'd found his father's frozen body in the snow. Some stories didn't need telling. When he returned to the fire, Wallace was back, talking business, timber prices, transport costs, the logistics of logging in Montana wilderness. Graham half listened, contributing when asked a direct question, but his attention kept drifting to Evelyn. She'd produced a small leather journal and was sketching something by firelight, her face absorbed in concentration. "What are you drawing?" The question surprised him almost as much as it surprised her. She hesitated, then turned the journal so he could see. It was the campsite, the fire, the lean-to, the horses standing together in the shadows. But it wasn't just accurate, it was alive somehow, capturing not just what things looked like, but how they felt. "You're good." "Thank you." She closed the journal, tucked it away. "I studied art before, well, before my father decided I'd be more useful in his business offices. Is that why you came west, to escape? Is that why you stay here, to escape? He almost smiled at having his own technique turned on him. Touché, Miss Hart. Evelyn, she corrected. If we're going to be camping together in the wilderness, we might as well dispense with formalities. Evelyn. Her name felt foreign on his tongue, too soft, too refined, but also right in a way he didn't want to examine too closely. And you're Graham, not Mr. Lark, not the guide. Graham. Something in his chest loosened, a knot he hadn't known was there. Graham, he agreed. The snow fell heavier and the wind picked up, but inside their small shelter the fire burned bright and the cold seemed distant. Wallace eventually bedded down, his snores providing a counterpoint to the storm. Graham and Evelyn stayed awake, talking in low voices about nothing and everything. Books they'd read, places they'd seen, dreams they'd had before life had taught them to dream smaller. Do you know what I love about winter? Evelyn asked, staring into the flames. The silence, the way snow muffles everything, makes the world feel clean and new. Winter's not clean, Graham said. It's brutal, unforgiving. Can't it be both? She looked at him, and in the firelight her eyes were gold and green and impossibly deep. Beautiful and brutal? Worth loving even though it hurts? He had no answer for that. Or rather, he had too many answers, none of which he was willing to speak aloud. Eventually, she stood, brushed snow from her coat. I should sleep. Tomorrow will be another long day. Evelyn. He stopped her with a word, not sure what he wanted to say, but knowing he couldn't let her leave without saying something. You asked earlier why I think dependency kills. The answer is, I've watched it happen. To people I loved. This place, Montana, it's magnificent, but it takes everything, your strength, your softness, your hope. If you depend on anyone but yourself, when they break, and they will break, you go down with them. She studied him for a long moment, snow catching in her hair, melting on her cheeks. Maybe you've just never met anyone strong enough not to break. Then she was gone, disappearing into the lean-to, leaving Graham alone with the fire and the snow and the uncomfortable sensation that something inside him was shifting, thawing, coming dangerously back to life. He sat up long after the fire burned down to embers, watching the snow fall and wondering what the hell he was doing, letting a woman he barely knew chip away at walls he'd spent 6 years building. The answer, he suspected, was both simple and terrifying. He was lonely. Had been lonely for so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to want someone's company, to share thoughts with another person, to hear his name spoken with something other than transaction or necessity. And Evelyn Hart, with her Eastern grace and her artist soul and her refusal to be intimidated by his rough edges, was exactly the kind of dangerous he couldn't afford. But dangerous things, he'd learned, had a way of being irresistible. The snow continued falling through the night, and Graham sat vigil by the dying fire, torn between the man he'd become and the man he used to be, between survival and the terrifying possibility of something more. When morning came, the world would be white and new, and they would ride deeper into the wilderness. But nothing, Graham suspected, would ever be quite the same again. Dawn broke cold and crystalline, the storm having passed in the night and left behind a world transformed. Graham woke to silence so complete it felt like the earth itself was holding its breath. He lay still for a moment beneath his bedroll, watching his exhalations fog in the frigid air, listening to the absolute quiet that only came after fresh snowfall in the high country. Then he heard it, the soft crunch of footsteps, the rustle of fabric. Someone was awake. He emerged from his shelter to find Evelyn standing at the edge of their camp, her back to him, staring out at the transformed landscape. Snow had piled nearly 2 feet deep overnight, draping every branch and boulder in white, turning the familiar pines into cathedral columns. The rising sun caught the crystals and made them sparkle like scattered stars. She didn't turn when he approached, but he saw her shoulders shift slightly, acknowledging his presence. For a long moment neither spoke, both simply watching as light spread across the valley below them, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold. "I've never seen anything like this," she finally said, her voice hushed, reverent. In Philadelphia, snow is just cold and gray and something to be endured. But this, she gestured helplessly at the vista before them. This is what cathedrals try to be and fail. Graham found himself looking at the landscape through her eyes, seeing what had become commonplace to him rendered new and miraculous. It's just winter, he said, but the words lacked conviction. No. She turned to face him, and her eyes were bright with something that looked like wonder. It's not just winter. It's proof that beauty doesn't require softness, that something can be harsh and unforgiving and still take your breath away. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was quieter. I think I'm beginning to understand why you stay. He wanted to tell her she was wrong, that she was romanticizing hardship, seeing poetry where there was only survival. But standing there in the pristine morning, watching dawn light catch in her hair and paint her face in shades of rose and amber, he couldn't find the words to deny what she'd said. Because she was right. This was why he stayed. Not for comfort or company or ease, but for moments like this, moments when the world revealed itself as something larger and more magnificent than the small struggles of human existence. We should wake your uncle, he said instead, breaking the spell. We've got hard riding ahead if we want to reach the timber tracks by afternoon. The moment passed. Evelyn nodded and moved toward the lean-to where Wallace still slept. Graham busied himself with the fire, coaxing last night's embers back to life, setting coffee to boil. Routine, familiar, safe. But his hands remembered the way she'd looked standing in the snow-bright dawn, and his chest carried a warmth that had nothing to do with the flames. They broke camp efficiently, Wallace proving himself more capable than Graham had given him credit for. Within an hour, they were mounted and moving, following the trail that climbed steadily toward Broken Ridge. The fresh snow made the going slower. The horses had to pick their way carefully, testing each step. But it also made the world feel newly made, untouched by human passage. Graham led them single file again, but this time Evelyn maneuvered her horse to ride beside him where the trail widened enough to permit it. Wallace seemed content to follow at a slight distance, giving them space that Graham wasn't sure he wanted but found himself grateful for nonetheless. Tell me about your mother, Evelyn said abruptly. Last night you mentioned loving people who broke. Was she one of them? He should have deflected, changed the subject, reminded her that his past was none of her concern. Instead, he found himself answering. She was from Boston, came west as a school teacher, met my father at a church social in Helena. He promised her adventure and a different kind of life. And did she get it? She got Montana. He kept his eyes on the trail ahead, on the rhythmic movement of his horse's ears, which is either the greatest adventure or the cruelest disappointment, depending on your perspective. Which was it for her? The question lodged somewhere beneath his ribs. Both, I think. She loved the land, the space, the wildness, the way every season felt like a story being told. She planted wildflowers around the house every spring, even though the deer ate most of them. She taught me to read using books she'd brought from Boston. She made our cabin feel like a home instead of just shelter. He paused, surprised by how easily the memories were flowing, how much he wanted to tell her things he'd never spoken aloud. But the isolation wore on her. The winters, the endless work. Watching her garden freeze, seeing her books get damaged by the moisture, having no one but my father and me for company month after month. By the time I was 12, she'd stopped planting flowers, stopped singing while she worked. She just faded, like she was slowly becoming invisible, even while she was still alive. How did she die? Pneumonia, quick and brutal. One week she had a cough, the next week she was gone. He swallowed against the tightness in his throat. My father never recovered. He kept the ranch running, kept us fed and sheltered, but the part of him that knew how to be human died with her. He taught me everything about surviving in Montana, but nothing about living. Evelyn was quiet for a long time, and Graham thought maybe he'd said too much, exposed too much vulnerability to someone who'd be gone from his life within days. Then her gloved hand reached across the space between their horses and briefly touched his arm. I'm sorry, she said simply. No platitudes, no empty reassurances that time healed all wounds, or that his mother was in a better place. Just acknowledgement, sincere and sufficient. It was a long time ago. Grief doesn't care about time. She pulled her hand back, but the warmth of that brief contact lingered. My mother died when I was 16. Cholera epidemic. One day she was teaching me how to arrange flowers for a dinner party. 3 days later, I was wearing black and learning that some absences never stop hurting. I'm sorry, he echoed, and meant it. So here we are, she said with a sad smile. Two people shaped by loss, riding through the most beautiful desolation I've ever seen. It's almost poetic. Poetry doesn't keep you warm. No, but it gives you a reason to want to be warm. She looked at him directly, and there was challenge in her gaze. You've built your whole life around surviving, Graham, but survival isn't the same as living. In Montana, it has to be. Does it? Or is that just what you've told yourself so long you've started believing it? Before he could respond, Wallace called out from behind them. How much farther to the timber tracks? Graham seized the interruption gratefully. Another 2 hours if the trail stays clear. We'll be climbing pretty steep for the next mile, then it levels out into the valley where the old growth is. They rode in silence after that, Evelyn dropping back to ride alongside her uncle, leaving Graham alone with his thoughts and the uncomfortable sensation that she'd seen through every defense he'd carefully constructed over the past 6 years. The trail narrowed and steepened, forcing them back into single file as they climbed toward the ridge. The horses strained against the grade, their breath coming in visible clouds. Graham's gelding was sure-footed, used to mountain trails, but he kept glancing back to check on the others. Wallace's mount was struggling slightly, and he had to admit a grudging respect for the older man's determination. But it was Evelyn who surprised him most. She moved with her horse instead of fighting it, leaning forward over the pommel on the steepest parts, giving the animal its head when it needed to pick its own path. She'd told the truth about being a rider. She just hadn't mentioned she was a good one. They crested the ridge just before noon, and Graham pulled up to let the horses breathe. Below them, the valley spread out like something from a painting. Thousands of acres of old-growth ponderosa, their massive trunks dark against the snow, their crowns green and full even in winter. It was timber worth a fortune, trees that had been growing since before the first trappers had come west. My God, Wallace breathed, dismounting to get a better view. I'd heard the descriptions, but this is extraordinary. Graham watched the older man's face transform with calculation and ambition, saw dollars and board feet and profit margins replacing whatever appreciation for natural beauty might have briefly flickered there. It was a look he'd seen before, on the faces of men who saw Montana as a resource to be extracted rather than a place to be respected. But Evelyn's expression was different. She stood slightly apart, her eyes moving across the valley with something that looked like mourning. How old are these trees? 300 years, some of them, maybe more. Graham moved to stand beside her. They were here before Montana was a territory, before there was a United States. And my uncle wants to cut them down. It wasn't a question, but he answered anyway. That's why we're here. She turned to face him, and her eyes held an accusation he hadn't expected. You could have refused to guide us, could have left us in Pine Creek without showing us this place. Would that have stopped him? Or would he have just hired someone else, someone less careful, someone who might have gotten you both killed on the trail? So you're complicit out of pragmatism. The words stung because they were true. I'm complicit because I live in the real world, where trees get cut and land gets sold, and men like your uncle make money while men like me survive on whatever scraps they're willing to throw. That's how it works out here. That's how it's always worked. It doesn't have to be. Doesn't it? He heard his voice rising, frustration breaking through his careful control. You've been in Montana for 2 days, Evelyn. 2 days. Don't stand there and tell me how it could be different when you'll be back in Philadelphia before the snow melts, back to your comfortable life where the hardest decision you face is which dress to wear to which party. She didn't flinch from his anger. Instead, she stepped closer, and her voice when she spoke was quiet but fierce. You don't know anything about my life, Graham. You don't know what I've sacrificed or what I've lost or what battles I've fought in ballrooms and boardrooms where the weapons are words instead of rifles, but the casualties are just as real. You think hardship is unique to the frontier? You think suffering requires snow and isolation? I think the frontier doesn't pretend to be anything but hard. And I think you use hardship as an excuse to keep everyone at a distance. Her eyes blazed. You wear your scars like armor and call it strength, But it's just another kind of cowardice. The words hit like a physical blow. For a moment, Graham couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but stare at this woman who'd somehow seen past every wall he'd built and struck directly at the truth he'd been hiding from for 6 years. "Graham, Miss Hart!" Wallace's voice cut through the tension. "Come look at these trunks. The timber here is even better than I'd hoped." Evelyn held Graham's gaze for one more moment, then turned and walked away, leaving him standing alone on the ridge with the taste of truth bitter in his mouth. They spent the next hour surveying the timber, Wallace making notes in a leather journal while Graham pointed out property boundaries and discussed access routes and logging logistics with the detached professionalism he used when selling cattle or negotiating for supplies. Evelyn remained silent, sketching in her own journal, capturing the trees with quick, sure strokes. When Wallace finally declared himself satisfied and ready to head back, the sun was already beginning its descent toward the western peaks. Graham calculated distances and light and made a decision. "We're not going back the way we came." Wallace looked up from his notes. "Why not?" "There's a line cabin about 2 hours northwest of here. It's closer than retracing our route, and there's another storm coming in tonight." He pointed to the clouds building on the horizon, dark and heavy with snow. "We push for the cabin, spend the night there, then make for Pine Creek in the morning. It's a longer overall route, but safer." "A cabin?" Evelyn spoke for the first time in an hour. "Whose?" "Mine, technically. My grandfather built it when he was exploring this area before he settled on the Circle L site. I use it sometimes when I'm checking traps or hunting in the high country." "How rustic are we talking?" Wallace asked, practical concerns overriding any romanticism. "4 walls, a roof, a fireplace, better than canvas in a blizzard." The decision made, they mounted and headed northwest, following a trail that was more suggestion than path, marked by Graham's memory more than any physical indicators. The clouds moved faster than he'd anticipated, and within an hour the light had gone gray and flat, the temperature dropping noticeably. They were still 30 minutes from the cabin when they heard it, a deep rumble that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, a sound that made Graham's blood freeze even as his training took over. "Ride!" he shouted, spurring his horse forward even as he reached back to grab Evelyn's reins. "Now, northwest, toward those rocks." "What?" Wallace started to ask, but the rumble became a roar, and then Graham saw it. High up on the ridge they'd just descended, the snow was moving, sliding, gathering speed and mass as it cascaded down the mountain. Avalanche. Time compressed and expanded simultaneously. Graham's world narrowed to essentials: the distance to safety, the speed of the approaching wall of snow, the terror in Evelyn's eyes as she realized what was happening. He couldn't reach Wallace, who was too far back, but he kept his grip on Evelyn's reins and drove both horses forward with desperate urgency. "The outcrop!" he screamed over the growing thunder. Get behind the outcrop!" The snow hit the valley floor behind them with a sound like mountains collapsing. Graham felt the shockwave, felt his horse stumble and nearly fall, felt Evelyn's mount crash into his as they scrambled for the shelter of a massive boulder that jutted from the hillside like a ship's prow. They made it with seconds to spare. The avalanche roared past, a river of white death that would have buried them, smothered them, erased them from existence as thoroughly as if they'd never been born. Graham threw himself from his saddle and pulled Evelyn down with him, covering her body with his as debris and snow dust rained down around them. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The roar faded to echoes, then to silence. The world stopped moving. Graham raised his head, coughing from the snow dust coating his lungs, and his first coherent thought was, "Evelyn." He pulled back to look at her, his hands frantically checking for injuries. "Are you hurt? Evelyn, are you hurt?" She was white-faced with shock but shook her head. I'm fine, but Uncle Wallace..." They both turned to look back at where Wallace had been, and Graham's heart sank. The trail was gone, buried under 15 feet of snow and debris. Trees had been snapped like matchsticks. Boulders the size of wagons had been tossed like pebbles. "Wallace!" Evelyn screamed, trying to stand, but Graham held her back. "Wait, listen." They both froze, straining for any sound over the settling debris. For a long moment there was nothing, and Graham felt sick certainty building in his gut. Then, Faint but clear came a voice. "Here! I'm here!" Graham was already moving, climbing over the snowfield, testing each step for stability. "Keep talking," he shouted. "Follow my voice." "I'm stuck." The horse fell, but I'm clear of the slide path. It took 20 minutes that felt like 20 hours, but finally Graham spotted movement. Wallace's arm waving from behind a cluster of pines that had somehow survived the avalanche's edge. The older man was shaken but uninjured, his horse standing wide-eyed but sound about 10 yards away. "Christ," Wallace said when Graham reached him. When I saw it coming." "Don't think about it." Graham gripped his shoulder, checking him over with practiced efficiency. "You're alive. That's what matters. Can you walk?" Yes, I think so." They made their way back to where Evelyn waited, her face streaked with tears of relief when she saw her uncle was safe. Wallace pulled her into a fierce hug, and Graham turned away to give them privacy and to assess their situation. It wasn't good. The avalanche had cut off their route back to Pine Creek and buried the trail to the timber tracks. Their only option now was to continue northwest to the line cabin and pray the weather held long enough for them to reach it before the next storm hit. He explained this to the Harts in terms that left no room for debate or discussion. They had one path forward, and they needed to take it now. "How far?" Wallace asked, his voice steadier now. "An hour if we push. Maybe longer in this snow." "Then we'd better move." They rode in tight formation, Graham taking point with the others close behind, all of them silent with the shared knowledge of how close they'd come to death. The trail climbed through dense forest, the trees providing some shelter from the wind that had begun to pick up as afternoon faded toward evening. Graham's thoughts were fragmented, scattered by adrenaline and the residual shock of the avalanche. But one image kept returning. The moment he'd pulled Evelyn from her horse, the weight of her in his arms, the fierce protective instinct that had flooded through him. He'd lost his parents to Montana's brutality. He'd seen men die in winter storms and women broken by the loneliness. He'd taught himself not to care, not to invest, not to let anyone matter enough that their loss could destroy him. But for those few seconds when the avalanche had been bearing down on them, none of that had mattered. He would have died to keep her safe, and the certainty of that terrified him more than the wall of snow had. The line cabin appeared through the trees like salvation made of logs and chinked mud. It was small, maybe 12 feet square, but solid, with a stone chimney and a door that swung open on leather hinges. Graham had been here 3 months earlier, had left it stocked with firewood and basic supplies against exactly this kind of emergency. He dismounted and pushed open the door, checking the interior quickly before gesturing the others inside. "Get warm. I'll see to the horses." By the time he'd unsaddled the animals and settled them in the lean-to he'd built against the cabin's north wall, night had fallen completely. He could see lamplight glowing through the cabin's single small window, and for a moment he stood in the darkness, watching the scene through the glass like something from a painting. Evelyn crouched by the fireplace, coaxing flames from kindling, Wallace examining shelves of canned goods and dried meat, both of them alive and safe in a tiny circle of light against the enormous darkness of the Montana wilderness. He'd kept them alive. He'd done his job. In the morning, they'd start for Pine Creek, and in a few days, Evelyn would board a stage and disappear back into a world of cities and civilization where avalanches were things you read about in newspapers, not things that tried to kill you. The thought should have brought relief. Instead, it felt like grief. He entered the cabin to find Evelyn had worked a small miracle. The fire was burning steadily, the lamp was lit, and she'd somehow located the coffee pot and set it to boil. Wallace was spreading bedrolls on the floor, his movements still slightly shaky but determined. "This place is remarkable," he said when he noticed Graham. "Primitive, yes, but everything you'd need to survive." "You built all this?" "My grandfather did most of it. I've just maintained it." Graham shrugged out of his coat, hung it on a peg. "There's beans and bacon in the larder. Not fancy, but it'll fill you up. After today, I'd eat tree bark and be grateful." Wallace clapped him on the shoulder. "Thank you, Graham, for getting us out of that. For keeping my niece safe. For everything." Graham nodded, uncomfortable with gratitude, and moved to help Evelyn with the fire. She glanced up at his approach, and something passed between them, acknowledgement of survival, recognition of shared danger, a connection forged in those moments when death had been close enough to touch. "You knew," she said quietly. "The second you heard that sound, you knew exactly what to do." Training, experience. It was more than that. She stood, brushing ash from her hands. "You didn't hesitate, didn't freeze, didn't even stop to think about your own safety. You just acted. That's how you survive out here. Thinking gets you killed." "Or it's how you love," she said, and before he could process what she meant, she'd turned away to tend the coffee. They ate in relative silence, exhaustion catching up with all of them, as the adrenaline faded and the warmth of the cabin worked its magic. Wallace was asleep within an hour, his snores filling the small space with a reassuring rhythm. But Evelyn remained awake, sitting cross-legged on her bedroll, her journal open in her lap, sketching by lamplight. Graham watched from his spot by the fire, watched her hand move across the paper in confident strokes, watched concentration furrow her brow. "What are you drawing?" She looked up, startled, as if she'd forgotten he was there. Then slowly she turned the journal so he could see. It was the avalanche, or rather, the moment after. She'd captured him pulling her from her horse, his face tight with fear and determination, her own expression somewhere between terror and trust. It was raw and honest and uncomfortably revealing. "You were there," she said simply. "When everything was chaos, when I couldn't think or breathe or do anything but be afraid, you were there. You kept me safe. It's what guides do." "No." She closed the journal, set it aside. "It's what people do when they care about someone, even if they're too stubborn to admit it." Graham felt something in his chest constrict. "Evelyn, you're going to tell me not to read too much into it," she interrupted. "That you would have done the same for anyone. That it's just survival instinct and frontier practicality and nothing more." She moved closer, until she was sitting beside him, close enough that he could feel her warmth through the cold air. "But I don't believe you." "What you believe doesn't change reality." "Then what is reality, Graham?" Her voice was soft but insistent. "That you've spent so many years alone, you've convinced yourself you prefer it. That you've buried your heart so deep you think it's gone? That you'd rather die than risk caring about someone again?" "Yes." The word came out harsh, desperate. "Because caring means losing. It always means losing. My mother cared, and Montana killed her. My father cared, and he spent his last years as a ghost. I watched them both fade away, and I swore I'd never—" He stopped, breathing hard, shocked by how much he'd revealed. Evelyn didn't touch him, didn't try to comfort him with empty platitudes. She just sat there, present and real and unbearably patient, waiting until his breathing steadied and he could look at her again. "I'm not your mother," she said finally. "I'm not fragile or delicate or unprepared for hardship. I've survived things that would break most people. The death of my mother, the casual cruelty of Philadelphia society, 5 years working in a business that treats women as decorative objects instead of human beings with minds and dreams and worth." Her eyes held his, refusing to let him look away. "I came west because I was suffocating, Graham. Because I needed to know if there was more to life than pretty prisons and polite suffocation." "And is there?" "I don't know yet." She smiled, sad and hopeful at once. "But I think I'm starting to find out." Outside, the wind rose to a howl, testing the cabin's walls, seeking entry. But inside, the fire burned steady, and the darkness kept its distance, and Graham sat with a woman who'd somehow slipped past every defense he'd spent 6 years constructing. "I'm afraid," he admitted, the words barely audible, "of this, of you, of what it means that I'd have died to keep you safe today." "I know." She finally did reach out then, her hand finding his in the firelight, her fingers threading through his with a rightness that terrified him. "I'm afraid too. But I think maybe courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing something despite the fear." He looked down at their joined hands, at the way her pale fingers contrasted with his weathered skin, at the simple miracle of human connection he'd denied himself for so long. Then he looked up and met her eyes, and in them he saw everything he'd lost and everything he might yet find if he could just be brave enough to reach for it. "Stay," he said, the word escaping before he could stop it. "When this is over, when your uncle's business is done, don't go back to Philadelphia. Stay." Stay. Surprise flickered across her face, followed by something that looked like joy, but then both faded into something more complex. Graham, forget I said it. He pulled his hand away, stood abruptly, putting distance between them. It's late. We should sleep. Long ride tomorrow. Graham, wait. But he'd already moved to his bedroll on the far side of the cabin, turning his back, closing himself off, because the alternative, staying, talking, risking even more vulnerability, was more than he could bear. He heard her sigh, heard the rustle as she settled into her own blankets, heard the lamp being extinguished. Darkness filled the cabin, broken only by the fire's dying glow. But he couldn't sleep. He lay awake listening to her breathing, to Wallace's snores, to the wind attacking the walls, and thought about the moment when the avalanche had been bearing down on them. The crystalline clarity of that instant, when every calculation had reduced to a single imperative. Save her. Nothing else had mattered. Not his carefully constructed isolation, not his determination to need no one, not his belief that caring was weakness. In that moment, he would have given everything to keep her safe. And the terrifying truth was, he still would. Somewhere in the darkness, Evelyn spoke. I heard you, you know. What you said before you tried to take it back. Graham didn't respond, didn't move, barely breathed. And for what it's worth, she continued, her voice soft but clear, part of me wants to say yes, wants to stay and see what might grow between us in this beautiful, brutal place. She paused. But I need you to understand something. I won't stay for a man who won't let himself love me. I won't stay to watch you build walls and call it protection. If I stay, it has to be because you're willing to try, really try, to open your heart again, not just for me, for yourself. Silence stretched between them, heavy with possibility and impossibility in equal measure. I don't know if I can, Graham finally said. I know, that's what scares me. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and relentless, covering the world in white silence. Inside the cabin, two people lay awake in the darkness, close enough to touch, but separated by walls that neither prayers nor proximity could break. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But the question had been asked, and in the asking, something fundamental had shifted. The avalanche hadn't killed them, but it had broken something loose, some frozen part of Graham's heart that had begun, against all his intentions, to thaw. Whether that would lead to growth or devastation remained to be seen. The fire burned down to embers, and eventually, exhaustion claimed them both. But even in sleep, Graham's hand remained outstretched across the small distance between his bedroll and hers, fingers reaching for something he couldn't name and didn't dare believe in. Tomorrow, they would ride for Pine Creek. Tomorrow, reality would reassert itself with all its complications and impossibilities. Tomorrow, the choice he'd offered and she'd complicated would need to be addressed. But for tonight, there was only the cabin, the snow, and the fragile, impossible hope that maybe, just maybe, two broken people might find a way to be whole together. Morning came too soon, and not soon enough. Graham woke to gray light filtering through the cabin's single window, and the sound of Evelyn moving quietly near the fireplace, coaxing the banked coals back to life. He watched her through half-closed eyes, this woman who'd somehow become essential to him in the space of 3 days, and felt the full weight of what he'd asked her last night settle on his chest like a stone. Stay. The single word hung in his mind, both plea and promise, both hope and terror. He'd meant it when he'd said it, but in the cold light of morning, the impossibility of what he was asking became clearer. What could he offer her? A hard life on a struggling ranch, winters that would test her spirit, isolation that would grind away at her cultured soul. He'd be asking her to choose the same fate his mother had chosen, and he'd watched how that story ended. Evelyn glanced over and caught him watching. Something passed across her face, recognition, maybe, or resignation, before she looked away and focused on the coffee pot. Morning, she said, her voice carefully neutral. I thought I'd let you and Uncle Wallace sleep a bit longer. The storm passed, but it's cold enough out there to freeze words before they leave your mouth. Graham sat up, the bedroll falling away, cold air hitting his skin and clearing the last fog of sleep. Wallace was still snoring softly on the far side of the cabin, oblivious to the tension crackling between his guide and his niece. We should head out soon as we can, Graham said, standing and moving to the window. Outside, the world was white and still, unmarred by tracks or movement, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. There's a pass about 2 hours south that should still be clear. We can make Pine Creek by nightfall if we don't run into trouble. And what are the odds of that? Not running into trouble? Evelyn handed him a tin cup of coffee, their fingers brushing in the exchange. Neither acknowledged the contact, but neither pulled away quickly. In Montana, about even odds on any given day. He sipped the coffee, grateful for its bitter heat. But we've got experience on our side now. You handled yourself well yesterday. Better than most would have. I was terrified. Courage isn't the absence of fear, he said, echoing her words from the night before. It's choosing something despite the fear. Her eyes met his, and for a moment the careful neutrality cracked, revealing something raw and uncertain underneath. Graham, about what you said last night, forget it. The words came out harsher than he'd intended. I spoke out of turn. The avalanche, the danger, it made me say things I shouldn't have. You've got a life in Philadelphia, responsibilities. It was unfair of me to ask you to give that up. That's not what I was going to say. Then what were you going to say? But before she could answer, Wallace stirred and sat up, groaning as his stiff muscles protested. Good Lord, I feel like I've been trampled by a herd of cattle. Is that coffee I smell? The moment shattered. Evelyn turned away to pour her uncle a cup, and Graham moved to gather his gear, and the conversation they needed to have dissolved into the mundane necessities of breaking camp and preparing to ride. Within the hour, they were mounted and moving south, following a trail that switched back down through pine forest toward the lower valleys. The morning was crystalline and brutal, the kind of cold that turned breath to ice crystals and made every exposed inch of skin ache. But the sky was clear and the wind had died, and Graham knew they'd make good time if nothing went wrong. They rode in silence at first, single file on the narrow trail, each lost in their own thoughts. Graham's mind kept circling back to Evelyn, to the question he'd asked and the answer she hadn't given. Part of him wanted to press, to know where he stood, to force a resolution one way or another. But another part, the part that had kept him alive and functional for 6 years, warned him to leave it alone, to let her return to Philadelphia and let this brief, impossible connection fade into memory. But memory, he was learning, was a poor substitute for presence. They stopped at noon to rest the horses and eat cold biscuits and jerky from Graham's supplies. Wallace wandered off to take in the view. They'd emerged from the forest onto a ridge that overlooked miles of snow-covered valleys and distant peaks. It was magnificent and terrible, the kind of landscape that made humans feel appropriately small. Evelyn stood beside her horse, one hand on its neck, her face turned toward the sun. Graham approached slowly, giving her time to hear him coming, to decide whether she wanted to talk or be left alone. There's something I want to show you, he said when he reached her. If you're willing, it'll add about 30 minutes to our journey, but we'll still make Pine Creek before dark. She turned to look at him, curious. What is it? A place my mother loved. A valley about a mile east of here. She used to say it was proof that even winter couldn't kill beauty. He hesitated, uncertain why he was offering this, why it suddenly felt important to share this piece of his past with her. I haven't been there since she died, but I think she'd want someone to see it, someone who understands. Evelyn studied his face for a long moment, and he had the unsettling sensation that she could see every thought he was trying to hide. Then she nodded. I'd like that, very much. He explained the detour to Wallace, who agreed readily, and they set off east, following what was barely a trail, more a remembered path through Graham's childhood. The forest here was older, denser, the pines massive and spaced wide enough that riding between them felt like moving through a cathedral of wood and snow. Then the trees opened up, and there it was, a small valley, maybe a quarter-mile across, ringed by pines and dominated by a frozen pond at its center. The surface of the ice was smooth as glass, dusted with snow in patterns the wind had made. Around the edges, snow-covered boulders jutted up like sculpture, and beyond them the forest rose toward distant peaks that caught the afternoon sun and glowed gold against the blue sky. It was, quite simply, perfect. Oh, Evelyn breathed beside him, and that single syllable held more understanding than 1,000 words could have conveyed. They dismounted at the valley's edge, and Graham found himself walking toward the pond as if pulled by invisible threads of memory. This was where his mother had brought him on winter afternoons when the cabin's walls felt too close and her homesickness for Boston became too heavy to bear. She'd taught him to ice skate here, using crude wooden skates his father had fashioned. They'd made snow angels and built snow fortresses and pretended for a few hours that Montana was a place of magic rather than hardship. She was happy here, he said, not realizing he'd spoken aloud until Evelyn responded. Tell me about her. Not about how she died or how she faded, but about who she was when she was alive. So he did. Standing at the edge of the frozen pond with the winter sun painting everything gold, he told Evelyn about his mother, about her laugh that had sounded like music, about the way she'd sung while she worked, about her determination to bring culture and refinement to a place that had little use for either. He told her about the books she'd read to him, the lessons she'd taught, the dreams she'd shared about the kind of man she hoped he'd become. She wanted me to be strong but not hard, he said. To be capable of surviving but not at the cost of my humanity. I think she'd be disappointed in what I've become. I don't think so. Evelyn moved closer until they were standing shoulder to shoulder, both staring out at the valley. I think she'd understand that you did what you had to do to survive, but I also think she'd want you to know that surviving isn't enough anymore, that you've proven you can endure, and now it's time to learn how to live again. And how do I do that? You start by accepting that caring about someone doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. She turned to face him, and her eyes were fierce with conviction. You start by understanding that love isn't a weakness to be avoided, but a risk worth taking. And you start by believing that maybe, just maybe, you deserve to be happy. I asked you to stay, he said, the words escaping before he could reconsider. Last night, in the cabin, I asked you to stay in Montana to give up your life in Philadelphia, and you started to answer, but we were interrupted. I need to know, Evelyn. I need to know what you were going to say. She was quiet for so long he thought she might not answer. Then she reached up and touched his face, her gloved fingers tracing the line of his jaw with a tenderness that made his chest ache. I was going to say yes, she said softly. Despite every rational thought in my head, despite not knowing you for more than 3 days, despite the impossibility and the insanity of it all, I was going to say, yes, I'll stay. Hope flared in Graham's chest, brilliant and terrifying. I need to know something first. Her hand dropped away, but her eyes held his. Are you asking me to stay because you care about me? Or because you're lonely? Are you asking me to be your partner, or just someone to fill the empty spaces in your house and your life? I don't know. The honesty cost him, but he owed her truth. I don't know how to separate those things anymore. I've been alone so long that caring and needing have gotten tangled up together. But I know that when I'm with you, the world feels less harsh. I know that when that avalanche came down, the only thing I could think was that I couldn't let you die. I know that the thought of you leaving feels like losing something I didn't know I needed until I found it. That's not the same as love. No, he agreed. But maybe it's the beginning of love. Maybe it's what's left after you've forgotten how to feel anything at all, and someone comes along and reminds you that you're still capable of it. A single tear tracked down her cheek, freezing in the cold air. I won't be your mother, Graham. I won't fade away while you watch and do nothing. If I stay, if we try this, you have to promise me that you'll fight for us, that you won't retreat into silence and self-protection the first time things get hard, that you'll let me in, really in, even when it scares you. I can't promise I'll be good at it. I'm not asking for good. I'm asking for willing. He looked at her standing there in the borrowed men's clothes, with snow in her hair and frost on her eyelashes, and saw not fragility, but strength. Saw not a delicate eastern flower that would wilt in Montana's harsh climate, but a woman who'd survived her own trials and emerged with her spirit intact. Saw not someone who needed his protection, but someone who could stand beside him as an equal. I'm willing, he said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. I'm willing to try. She smiled then, radiant despite the tears, and closed the distance between them. When she kissed him, it was soft and tentative and flavored with salt and cold and promise. Graham stood frozen for half a heartbeat, shocked by the simple miracle of human contact after so many years of isolation. Then his arms came up and pulled her closer, and he kissed her back with all the desperate hope and terrified longing he'd been holding at bay. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Wallace's voice drifted across the valley. I hate to interrupt what appears to be a significant moment, but it's getting colder, and I'd very much like to reach town before my extremities freeze solid. They broke apart, laughing, and Graham realized he was laughing, actually laughing, for the first time in longer than he could remember. Evelyn's hand found his and squeezed, and they walked back to their horses together, their joined hands visible proof that something fundamental had changed. The ride to Pine Creek took on a different quality after the valley. Where before there had been tension and unspoken questions, now there was a fragile understanding, an agreement to try. Graham found himself pointing out landmarks to Evelyn. The ridge where he'd shot his first elk, the meadow where spring wildflowers would bloom in impossible profusion, the creek where he'd learned to fish as a boy. He was sharing his Montana with her, trusting her with the landscape that had shaped him. And she received it all with the same attention she'd given the Timber Valley, seeing not just scenery, but story, understanding that every rock and tree held memory and meaning. They reached Pine Creek just as the sun was setting, painting the town in shades of orange and gold. The sight of the familiar buildings should have brought relief, but instead Graham felt a twist of anxiety. Here, in civilization such as it was, reality would reassert itself. Wallace would conduct his business. Evelyn would have time to reconsider her impulsive decision. The spell of the wilderness would break, and she'd remember all the reasons why staying in Montana was impossible. But as they rode down the main street toward the hotel, Evelyn's hand reached across the gap between their horses and brushed his arm. When he looked over, she was smiling, and the fear in his chest eased slightly. Maybe. Just maybe. They stopped in front of the hotel, where Gerald Foster emerged to greet them, his face showing relief at their safe return. Thank God. We'd heard about the avalanche up near Broken Ridge. When you didn't come back yesterday, we feared the worst. We took shelter in the line cabin, Graham explained, dismounting and helping Evelyn down. Her legs were unsteady after hours in the saddle, and she gripped his arms for balance, her face so close to his he could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes. Well, you're safe now, and that's what matters. Foster gestured toward the hotel. Come in, warm yourselves. I'll have Martha draw baths and prepare supper. Wallace headed inside immediately, clearly eager for the comforts of civilization, but Evelyn lingered on the boardwalk, and Graham found himself reluctant to leave her. There was something unfinished between them, some acknowledgement that needed to be made. I should get these horses to the livery, he said, not moving, and I should go inside, wash off 3 days of trail dust. She didn't move either. They stood there in the gathering dusk, the space between them charged with possibility and uncertainty. Finally, Evelyn spoke. Will I see you tomorrow? If you want to. I want to. She hesitated, then added, We need to talk. Really talk. About what staying here would mean, about logistics and reality and all the things we've been avoiding. I know. He did know, and the knowing terrified him. Because talking meant confronting all the reasons why this was impossible, why a wealthy woman from Philadelphia had no business throwing her life away on a Montana rancher. Morning. I could come by after I finish at the livery. Morning would be good. She reached up and touched his cheek again, the gesture already becoming familiar. Thank you, Graham, for showing me your mother's valley, for sharing that with me. Thank you for understanding why I needed to. She smiled and turned to go, then paused at the hotel door. Oh, and Graham? For what it's worth, I think your mother would be proud of the man you've become. Proud that you survived, and proud that you're finally willing to try to do more than just survive. Then she was gone, disappearing into the warm glow of the hotel, and Graham was left standing in the cold evening with his horses and the weight of hope he'd thought he'd never feel again. He took the horses to the livery, spending longer than necessary brushing them down and checking their hooves, delaying the moment when he'd have to ride back to the Circle L and sit alone with his thoughts. Old Pete, the livery owner, watched him work with knowing eyes. Heard you took the Hart girl into the back country, Pete said, not looking up from the bridle he was mending. Heard she handled herself pretty well. She did. Heard you got caught in that avalanche up by Broken Ridge. Lucky you knew where the line cabin was. Lucky, Graham agreed, though luck didn't begin to describe it. She's a fine woman, that Miss Hart. Pete's tone was carefully casual. Be ashamed to see her head back east. Town could use more folks with backbone. Graham knew what Pete was really asking, knew the old man was one of the few people in Pine Creek who actually gave a damn what happened to him. Maybe she won't go back. Pete's hand stilled on the bridle. That's so. Maybe. Well, Pete set aside his work and looked at Graham directly. If she stays, you be good to her, you hear? Don't let Montana make you cruel. There's enough cruelty in this world without adding to it. I'll try. That's all any of us can do. Pete picked up his work again. Your daddy tried, you know, after your mama passed. He tried real hard to keep going, to be there for you. But grief is a heavy burden, and sometimes a man can't carry it and still function. Don't judge him too harshly. Graham felt his throat tighten. I don't. Good. And don't judge yourself too harshly either. You did what you had to do to survive, and there's no shame in that. But if you get a chance at something more than survival, something that might actually make you happy, don't throw it away out of fear. The words settled into Graham's chest like seeds in winter soil, dormant now, but carrying the potential for growth come spring. He thanked Pete and mounted his horse for the ride back to the ranch. But the old man's wisdom rode with him through the darkness. The Circle L looked lonely when he arrived, a single dark structure against the snow-white landscape. No smoke from the chimney, no light in the windows, no welcoming warmth, just cold reality. This was what he was asking Evelyn to choose, this isolation, this hardship, this grinding daily battle against a land that didn't care whether you lived or died. But as he built up the fire and lit the lamp and made himself a sparse supper, he couldn't help but imagine her there, couldn't help but picture her at the stove cooking, or sitting at the table sketching, or curled up in the chair his mother used to favor, reading by firelight. The house would feel different with her in it, feel less like a shelter and more like a home. The question was whether she'd still feel the same way after a month, a year, a decade of Montana winters. Whether the romance of the frontier would survive contact with its brutal reality. Whether love, if that's what this was, would be enough to sustain her when the loneliness and the cold and the endless work wore away at her spirit. He'd watched it happen to his mother. He couldn't bear to watch it happen to Evelyn. But then he remembered her face when she'd seen the Timber Valley, the wonder and the mourning mixed together, remembered her determination on the trail, the way she'd adjusted to the saddle and the cold without complaint, remembered her standing in the avalanche's aftermath, shaken but unbroken. And he thought maybe, just maybe, she was stronger than he was giving her credit for. Maybe she was strong enough to choose this life with full knowledge of what it would cost. Or maybe he was being a selfish fool, and love, if that's what this was just another name for selfishness. Graham spent a restless night wrestling with these thoughts, and when dawn finally came, he was no closer to answers. He did his morning chores mechanically, fed the cattle, checked the water, repaired a section of fence that had come loose in the wind. Physical work that occupied his hands and gave his mind space to circle endlessly around the same questions. By mid-morning, he could delay no longer. He saddled his horse and rode into Pine Creek, his heart beating harder with each mile that passed. What would she say? Had the cold light of morning changed her mind? Had Wallace talked sense into her, reminded her of all she'd be giving up? The hotel dining room was quiet when he arrived, most of the breakfast crowd already dispersed to their various labors. But Evelyn was there, sitting by the window with a cup of tea, her journal open on the table before her. She'd changed into a proper dress, deep blue with cream lace at the collar, and her hair was pinned up in the Eastern style. She looked beautiful and refined and utterly out of place, and Graham's courage almost failed him. Then she looked up and saw him, and her face transformed with a smile that made his chest ache. "You came," she said, standing as he approached. "I wasn't sure you would." "I said I would." "I know, but I also know you spent the night second-guessing everything, convincing yourself this was impossible." Her eyes searched his face. "Am I wrong?" "No," he admitted. "You're not wrong." "Good, because I spent the night doing the same thing, and I think we need to have the conversation we've been avoiding. The one where we're honest about all the very good reasons why this is a terrible idea. She gestured to the seat across from her. Sit. Let's talk like adults instead of people caught up in the romance of surviving danger together. Graham sat, grateful and terrified in equal measure. A server brought coffee without being asked, Martha Foster, who'd known Graham since he was a boy and knew his preferences. She winked at him before disappearing, and he wondered if the entire town was already gossiping about him and the Hart girl. Your uncle? He asked, looking around. Meeting with the land agent about the timber tracts. He'll be gone for hours. She wrapped her hands around her teacup, which gives us time to be completely honest with each other. All right. Graham took a breath. Honestly, I'm terrified. Terrified that you'll stay and regret it. Terrified that Montana will break you the way it broke my mother. Terrified that I'll fail you somehow. That I won't be enough to make up for everything you'd be giving up. Evelyn nodded slowly. And honestly, I'm terrified too. Terrified that I'm making a decision based on emotion rather than reason. Terrified that the romance of the frontier will fade and I'll be left with just the hardship. Terrified that I don't actually know you well enough to be making a life-changing decision. They sat in silence for a moment, the honesty hanging between them like a bridge and a barrier both. So why are we even considering this? Graham asked. If we're both so terrified, why not just acknowledge it was nice while it lasted and go our separate ways? Because, Evelyn said, leaning forward, her eyes intense, despite the terror, despite the rational objections, despite everything that says this is impossible, I don't want to go our separate ways. I want to know what might happen if we're brave enough to try. That's not a plan. That's not even a good reason. No, it's not. She smiled, sad and hopeful. But it's the truth. And I think after everything we've been through, we owe each other truth. Graham wanted to argue, wanted to present all the logical reasons why this couldn't work, but looking at her across the table, at this woman who'd ridden into town 4 days ago and somehow turned his entire world on its axis, he couldn't find the words. What would it look like? He asked instead. If you stayed, practically speaking. I don't know. She pulled her journal toward her, open to a blank page. That's what we need to figure out. Let's start with the obvious questions. Where would I live? The ranch house is small, but there's room. We could add on if needed. And what would I do? I'm not going to be a decorative object, Graham. I need purpose. The ranch needs work, lots of it. Someone to keep the books, handle correspondence, manage supplies, someone to help with the cattle come spring, someone to... He stopped, realizing what he was describing. A partner. Not a wife to be taken care of, but a partner who shares the work. Yes. Her eyes lit up. That's exactly what I mean. Could you accept that? Accept me as an equal, not just someone you're responsible for protecting. I don't know, he said honestly. I've been alone for 6 years. I'm used to making decisions without consulting anyone, to doing things my way. It would be an adjustment. For both of us. She made a note in her journal. What about money? I have some savings, enough to help with improvements to the ranch, but I'd be giving up my position in my father's business, which means giving up that income. The Circle L makes enough to live on. Not luxuriously, but comfortably. We wouldn't starve. Graham felt strange discussing finances with her, but it was necessary. Though winters are lean sometimes, there'd be months where we'd have to be careful. I can be careful. She wrote something else. What about society? Pine Creek isn't Philadelphia. There are no opera houses, no art galleries, no literary salons. No, he agreed. But there are people. Good people, mostly. And there's beauty, if you know where to look for it. Your mother's valley isn't the only place worth seeing. I know, I've seen enough to know that. She looked up from her notes. But would it be enough? 10 years from now, 20, would I still feel like it was enough? That's what I don't know. I can't answer that for you. I know. She set down her pen. Graham, I need to tell you something about why I came west. I told you I was suffocating in Philadelphia, but it was more than that. I was dying there. Slowly, invisibly, but dying nonetheless. Every day, feeling more like a ghost in my own life. Going through motions that meant nothing, pretending to care about things that didn't matter. She took a shaky breath. When my uncle asked if I wanted to come to Montana, I said yes before he'd finished the question. Not because I knew what I'd find here, but because I knew I couldn't keep living the way I was. So the real question isn't whether Montana will be enough. It's whether I'm strong enough to build a life that matters, in a place that demands everything I have to give. Graham reached across the table and took her hand, the gesture feeling both natural and monumental. You're strong enough. I've seen it. But strength doesn't mean you have to do it alone. If you stay, if we try this, we face it together. The good and the bad, the beauty and the brutality. Together. Together, she repeated, testing the word. Then she laughed, the sound carrying equal parts joy and disbelief. We're really doing this, aren't we? We're really considering building a life together based on 3 days of knowing each other and one impulsive kiss in a frozen valley. We're considering it, Graham confirmed, but we don't have to decide today. Your uncle's business will keep him here for at least another week. That's time for you to see more of Montana, to see the ranch, to really think about what you'd be choosing. And time for you to decide if you really want this, if you're really willing to let someone back into your life, with all the risk and vulnerability that entails. Her hand tightened on his. Because I meant what I said, Graham. I won't fade away while you watch. If I stay, you have to meet me halfway. You have to be willing to open your heart, even when it terrifies you. I know. He met her eyes. And I'll try. That's all I can promise. I'll try. They sat there for a long time, hands joined across the table, the hotel dining room quiet around them. Outside, Pine Creek went about its business, horses clopping past, men calling greetings, the daily rhythm of frontier life continuing regardless of the monumental decisions being made over cooling coffee and tea. Finally, Evelyn spoke. Show me the ranch, tomorrow. I want to see where you live, how you live. I want to understand what I'd really be choosing. Tomorrow, Graham agreed. And Evelyn? Thank you. For what? For being brave enough to consider this, for seeing something worth trying in a broken-down rancher who'd forgotten how to hope. She stood, still holding his hand, and pulled him to his feet. They stood close, the table no longer between them, and she looked up into his face with fierce determination. You're not broken, Graham Lark. You're wounded, yes. Wary, certainly, but not broken. And maybe together we can both learn what it means to be whole. Then she kissed him, right there in the hotel dining room where anyone could see, and Graham kissed her back, no longer caring about propriety or gossip or what anyone might think. For the first time in 6 years, he was choosing something other than survival. He was choosing possibility, choosing risk, choosing to believe that maybe, despite all evidence to the contrary, love might actually be worth the cost. When they finally pulled apart, Martha Foster was watching from the kitchen doorway, a knowing smile on her weathered face. She nodded once, approving, then disappeared back into her domain. Tomorrow, Evelyn said again, her voice slightly breathless. Come at dawn. I want to see the sunrise from your land. Dawn it is. Graham left the hotel walking on air and dread in equal measure, his mind already racing ahead to tomorrow, to showing Evelyn his home, to the moment when reality would have its say about their impossible plans. But beneath the anxiety there was something else, a fragile, growing thing that felt dangerously like happiness. He spent the rest of the day preparing the ranch house, cleaning with an attention to detail he hadn't bothered with in years. He fixed the broken step on the porch, replaced the cracked window pane in the kitchen, put fresh linens on the spare bed in case she wanted to see where she might sleep. He was nervous as a schoolboy and felt foolish for it, but he couldn't help himself. This mattered. She mattered. And for the first time since his father died, the future felt like something more than just another season to survive. That night, he lay awake listening to the wind test the walls and thought about his mother's valley, about the way Evelyn had understood immediately why that place mattered. Thought about her standing in the avalanche's aftermath, shaken but unbroken. Thought about her voice saying, together, with conviction and hope. Maybe they would fail. Maybe Montana would prove too harsh, or the isolation too complete, or the weight of their respective wounds too heavy to carry together. Maybe this was the beginning of a heartbreak that would make his previous losses seem small by comparison. But maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of something else entirely. Something worth the risk. Something his mother would have called a Christmas miracle, even though Christmas had come and gone and winter showed no signs of loosening its grip. Outside, snow began to fall again, and Graham watched it through the window until his eyes grew heavy and sleep finally claimed him. His last thought before darkness took him was of Evelyn's smile and the impossible promise of tomorrow. Dawn would come. She would come with it, and whatever happened after that, at least he would know he'd been brave enough to try. That had to count for something. Dawn came in shades of lavender and rose, painting the snow-covered rangeland in colors so delicate they seemed impossible in a place as harsh as Montana. Graham had been awake for an hour already, pacing the porch despite the cold, watching the road from Pine Creek with an anxiety that made him feel 17 again instead of 25. He changed his shirt twice, combed his hair more times than he cared to admit, and generally behaved like a fool over a woman he'd known less than a week. But she wasn't just any woman. She was Evelyn Hart, and somehow, in the space of those few days, she'd become the axis around which his world turned. He saw her coming while the sky was still more dark than light, a solitary figure on horseback moving through the pre-dawn gloom with confidence that spoke of growing familiarity with western trails. She'd borrowed men's clothes again, the same canvas trousers and wool coat she'd worn into the backcountry, and her hair was braided down her back. Even from a distance, Graham could feel his heart responding to her presence, that strange tightening in his chest that was equal parts hope and terror. She reached the house just as the sun broke over the eastern peaks, flooding the valley with golden light. Graham stepped down from the porch to help her dismount, and when his hands closed around her waist, he felt the rightness of it, the way their bodies already knew how to move together despite the newness of everything between them. "You came," he said, the words inadequate but all he could manage. "Did you think I wouldn't?" She looked up at him, her face glowing in the sunrise, and smiled. "I told you I wanted to see your land. I meant it." "Come on, then." He took her horse's reins and led both animals toward the barn. "Let me show you the Circle L." He'd planned this out during his sleepless night, had mapped a route that would show her the ranch at its best while being honest about its challenges. They started with the barn, where his dozen head of cattle were already stirring, their breath fogging in the cold morning air. Evelyn moved among them without fear, running her hands over their flanks, asking intelligent questions about breeding and feed and winter survival rates. "They're beautiful," she said, pausing beside a young heifer. "Healthy looking. You take good care of them." "They're my livelihood. Taking care of them is taking care of myself." He showed her the hay stores, the grain bins, the careful systems he'd developed for winter feeding. "It's not much compared to Eastern operations, I know, but it's mine, free and clear. No debts, no obligations." "That matters," she said, and he could tell she understood the pride behind the words, the hard-won independence they represented. From the barn they walked to the house, and Graham felt his nervousness return as he opened the door and gestured her inside. This was it, the reality of what he was offering. A two-room cabin with the loft, spare and functional, nothing like the Philadelphia townhouse where she'd grown up. But Evelyn moved through the space with thoughtful attention, her artist's eye taking in details he'd stopped noticing years ago. The solid craftsmanship of his father's carpentry, the way morning light came through the east window and painted the rough wooden walls in gold. The shelf of his mother's books, still carefully preserved. The fireplace his grandfather had built from river stone. "It's honest," she said finally, turning to face him. "No pretense, no decoration for decoration's sake. Just what's needed to live and nothing more." Is that a good thing or a bad thing? She moved to the bookshelf, running her fingers over the spines. "It's honest," she repeated, "and I've spent too many years in places that valued appearance over substance. This place values substance. I can respect that." She pulled out a volume, his mother's copy of Wordsworth, and opened it carefully. On the flyleaf, in faded ink, was an inscription. "To Margaret, who understands that beauty exists even in wild places. With love, James." "Your father gave this to your mother," Evelyn said softly, "before they married, before she knew what wild places really meant." Graham took the book from her, stared at his father's handwriting. "I used to think it was a lie, that inscription, that he'd tricked her with romantic words and then brought her to a place that killed romance.
But now I think maybe he really believed it. Believed that love and poetry could survive out here. Could they? She took the book back, held it like the precious thing it was. Did they survive for your parents? For a while. Maybe longer than I gave them credit for. He moved to the window, looked out at the land that had shaped and scarred him in equal measure. My mother never stopped loving this place. Not entirely. Even at the end, even when the isolation was crushing her, she'd still have moments where she'd look at the mountains or the sky and her face would light up, like she was remembering why she'd chosen this life. And your father? Did he still love her? Until the day he died. Maybe that's why he died. Walked out into that blizzard checking on cattle he could have checked the next morning. I think part of him wanted to follow her, wanted to stop fighting so hard to stay in a world where she didn't exist anymore. Evelyn set the book down and came to stand beside him at the window. Outside, the ranch spread before them. The barn, the corrals, the fenced pastures stretching toward the tree line, the mountains rising beyond like promises or warnings depending on your perspective. Is that what you're afraid of? She asked quietly. That I'll die and you'll follow? The bluntness of the question should have shocked him, but instead it felt like relief, like someone finally naming the fear that had haunted him for 6 years. Part of it, yes, but more than that, I'm afraid I'll watch you fade the way my mother did. Watch the light go out of your eyes as the winters pile up and the isolation grinds you down. Watch you become a ghost while still alive, going through motions but not really living. And what if I don't fade? She turned to face him fully, her voice gaining strength. What if I'm stronger than your mother was? What if I thrive here instead of just surviving? Then I'd be the luckiest man in Montana. He met her gaze, forced himself to be as honest as she was being. But I'd still be terrified every single day that I'd wake up and find it had all been temporary. That you'd realized you'd made a mistake and there was nothing I could do to fix it. Graham. She took his hands, held them between her own. I can't promise I won't have doubts. I can't promise every day will be easy or that I'll never miss Philadelphia or that this will be some perfect frontier fairy tale. But I can promise that if I make this choice, if I choose to stay, it will be because I've thought it through completely. It won't be impulse or romance or running away from my old life. It will be a conscious decision to build a new life, here, with you. When will you know? The question came out rough, desperate. When will you be sure? I don't know. She squeezed his hands. That's why I'm here. To see everything, understand everything, before I make a choice that will affect the rest of both our lives. He nodded, accepting this even as part of him wanted to demand an answer now, wanted certainty in a situation defined by uncertainty. Then let me show you the rest. They spent the morning riding the property, Graham pointing out boundaries and landmarks, explaining the rhythms of ranch life through the seasons. He showed her where spring runoff created natural irrigation for hay meadows, where winter wind could pile drifts 20 feet high against canyon walls, where his father had died trying to save cattle that weren't worth a man's life. Evelyn absorbed it all in silence, asking occasional questions but mostly just observing, and Graham found himself grateful for her quietness. She wasn't chattering to fill the silence or pretending to understand more than she did. She was simply learning, taking the measure of this place that might become her home. They stopped for lunch at his mother's valley, the same place where they'd kissed the day before. Graham had packed bread and cheese and apples, simple food eaten with cold fingers, but sitting there beside the frozen pond with Evelyn, it felt like the finest meal he'd ever shared. Tell me about the worst, she said, breaking a long, comfortable silence. Not the worst that's already happened, but the worst that could happen. If I stay, if we build a life together, what's the thing that keeps you awake at night? He thought about deflecting, about sparing her the darkness of his thoughts, but she deserved truth. That I'll fail you when you need me most. That there'll be a moment, a medical emergency, a financial crisis, some catastrophe I can't control, and I won't be enough. That you'll die because I couldn't get you to a doctor fast enough, or we'll lose everything because one bad winter kills the herd, or you'll simply realize too late that I'm not the man you thought I was. Those are all external things, she observed. Circumstances beyond your control. What about the internal things? What about the ways we might fail each other simply by being human and flawed? He hadn't expected that question,
hadn't thought past the dramatic disasters to the slow erosion that happened in the daily grind of coexistence. "I'm not good with words," he said slowly. "I'm used to silence, to working through problems alone. You'll want to talk, to share, to process things together, and I'll retreat into myself because that's what I've learned to do. We'll hurt each other in small ways that add up over time." "Yes," she agreed. "We probably will. And I'll bring my own failures to the marriage. I'm stubborn and opinionated, and I hate being told what to do. I'll push when you need space and demand explanations when you have none to give. I'll compare Montana to Philadelphia in moments of weakness and make you feel like you're not enough, even when you are." So why are we even considering this?" The question burst out of him, frustration and fear tangled together. "If we can see all the ways it might fail, all the pain we might cause each other, why not just stop now before we're in too deep?" Evelyn was quiet for a long moment, staring at the frozen pond with an expression he couldn't quite read. Then she turned to face him, and her eyes held something fierce and certain. "Because the alternative is spending the rest of our lives wondering what might have been. Because I've already lived in the safe choice, the sensible choice, the choice that looked perfect on paper and felt like death by inches. And because despite everything, despite the fear and the uncertainty and the very real possibility of failure, when I imagine my future, you're in it. This place is in it. And the not knowing doesn't scare me as much as the thought of never trying." Graham felt something crack open in his chest, some final wall he'd been holding up against hope and possibility. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. "How to love someone without being terrified of losing them. How to let someone in without feeling like I'm giving them the power to destroy me." "Neither do I," she said. "But maybe we can figure it out together. Maybe that's what love is, not the absence of fear, but the choice to move forward despite it." He kissed her then, there beside his mother's frozen pond, and it felt different from their first kiss in the valley. That one had been born of relief and survival and the shock of unexpected connection. This one was a choice, conscious and deliberate, a stepping forward into unknown territory with eyes wide open. When they pulled apart, both breathing hard in the cold air, Graham made a decision. "There's one more place I need to show you, the hardest place." They rode northwest, climbing into the hills beyond the ranch's main pastures. The snow was deeper here, the trees closer together, the trail barely visible. But Graham knew the way by heart. He'd ridden it once a year, every year since his father's death. The grave was simple, just a marker of river stone with his father's name and date scratched into the surface, weathered by 6 years of Montana weather. Beside it, a smaller marker for his mother, even though she was actually buried in the Pine Creek Cemetery. Graham had placed it there so they could be together in this spot his father had loved, a ridge that overlooked the entire valley. Evelyn dismounted and stood before the graves in silence. Graham watched her, waiting for her reaction, needing to see how she responded to this tangible reminder of all the grief and loss that had shaped him. Finally, she spoke. "You come here often." "Once a year, on the anniversary of my father's death." "Why not more often?" "Because it hurts," he said simply. "Because standing here reminds me of everything I lost and everything I'm afraid to lose again." "But you brought me here anyway." "Yes." "Why?" He moved to stand beside her, both of them looking down at the simple markers. "Because if you're going to choose this life, you need to understand all of it, not just the beautiful valleys and the magnificent views, but the graves too, the cost, the price Montana extracts from everyone who tries to make a life here." Evelyn reached down and brushed snow from his mother's marker, her touch gentle and reverent. "Margaret Lark. She was how old when she died?" 36. "The same age I'll be in 10 years. She looked up at him. "Is that what you see when you look at me? Your mother's fate waiting to repeat itself?" "Sometimes," he admitted. "More often than I want to." "Then I need you to hear this, Graham, and really understand it." She stood and took both his hands in hers, her grip firm and steady. "I am not your mother. I won't pretend the similarities aren't there. We're both Eastern women choosing Montana, both leaving comfortable lives for something harder and more real. But the circumstances are different. I'm choosing this with full knowledge of the cost. I've seen your mother's valley and your father's grave. I've ridden through avalanche country and slept in line cabins and felt what Montana winter really means. I'm not a young bride being swept away by romance. I'm a grown woman making an informed decision. People change, he said. Circumstances change. What feels possible at 24 might feel impossible at 36. You're right, and I might reach 36 and regret every choice I've made. Or I might reach it and look back with gratitude at the life I've built. She moved closer until they were standing toe-to-toe in the snow. But Graham, the same is true of any life, anywhere. I could stay in Philadelphia and be hit by a carriage next year. I could marry some wealthy merchant and die in childbirth. I could live to be 90 and spend every day regretting the chances I didn't take. There are no guarantees, not in Montana and not anywhere else. At least in Philadelphia, you'd have doctors and hospitals and die of boredom and suffocation, she interrupted. Graham, you keep talking about survival like it's the highest goal, but I don't want to just survive. I want to live, really live, in a place that demands everything I have to give and rewards me with something real in return, even if it's hard, even if it's dangerous, even if I only get 10 good years instead of 50 mediocre ones. He stared at her, this woman who kept surprising him with her strength and clarity, and felt his carefully constructed arguments crumbling. You terrify me, he said honestly. Good. She smiled, fierce and beautiful. You should be terrified. I'm asking you to trust me with your heart after years of protecting it. I'm asking you to believe in a future you've spent 6 years convinced was impossible. That's terrifying for both of us. What if I can't? The question came out barely above a whisper. What if I'm too damaged, too wary, too broken by loss to be what you need? Then we'll fail, she said simply. We'll try our best and we'll fail, and it will hurt like hell, and we'll both be worse off than if we'd never met. But at least we'll have tried. At least we'll know we were brave enough to reach for something real instead of settling for safe. Graham looked past her to his parents' graves, those simple stone markers that represented every fear he carried. His mother had tried. His father had tried. They'd loved each other fiercely, and it hadn't been enough to overcome Montana's brutality. What made him think he and Evelyn would fare any better? But then he thought about the past few days, about her calm competence on the trail, her determination in the face of the avalanche, her clear-eyed assessment of what life on the Circle L would really mean. She wasn't his mother, fragile and ultimately unprepared despite her best intentions. She was something else entirely, something stronger and more resilient than he'd given her credit for. My mother loved wildflowers, he heard himself saying. Every spring she'd plant them around the house, even though she knew the deer would eat them. My father would tell her she was wasting her time, that Montana wasn't meant for delicate things. But she'd do it anyway, and for a few weeks every May the house would be surrounded by color and beauty. What happened to them? The flowers? After she died, they kept coming back. Turns out some of them had taken root deep enough to survive on their own. They're still there, around the house. I see them every spring, and I think about her, about how she refused to let Montana turn everything gray and colorless. Evelyn understood what he was really saying, could see it in the way her expression softened. She was stronger than you thought. Yes, and I've spent 6 years believing she wasn't, believing Montana killed her when maybe it was just her time. Maybe she would have died at 36 no matter where she lived, and at least this way she got to spend her years somewhere beautiful, somewhere she chose, with someone she loved. Is that what you really believe? Or just what you want to believe? I don't know. He pulled her close, wrapped his arms around her, needing the warmth and solidity of her presence. But I'm starting to think it doesn't matter. Whether Montana killed her or just failed to save her, the result was the same. And spending my life afraid of that result isn't protecting me, it's just making me half alive. But they stood there in the snow, holding each other beside the graves of his parents, and Graham felt something shift inside him. Not a healing. He wasn't naive enough to think one conversation could undo 6 years of grief and fear, but a loosening, a willingness to consider the possibility that maybe the past didn't have to dictate the future. I want to try, he said into her hair. I want to believe we can make this work. But I need time, Evelyn. I need time to learn how to trust again, how to let someone in without waiting for them to leave. I know. She pulled back to look at him. And I need time too. Time to see more of Montana, to experience life here beyond a few days on the trail, Time to be absolutely certain before I make a choice that will affect both of us. How much time? Your uncle's business will keep him here through New Year's, she said. Let's use that time. Let me spend days at the ranch, learning the work and the rhythm of life here. Let me meet the townspeople, see Pine Creek in winter, understand what community means in a place like this, and let you get to know me beyond the romance of survival and shared danger. Let's see if what we feel is real enough to build a life on. It was sensible, pragmatic, exactly the kind of plan that should have reassured him. But part of Graham wanted to protest, wanted to demand that she decide now, that she commit before his nerve failed or circumstances changed, or the universe reminded them both that happy endings were rare as summer snow in Montana. But that impulse came from fear, and he was trying to be brave. All right, he agreed, through New Year's. And then, if you're still sure, if you still want this life, we'll talk about the future. Really talk. About marriage and partnership and all the practical details we've been avoiding. Deal. She held out her hand, formal and businesslike, and he shook it, both of them suddenly laughing at the absurdity of sealing such a momentous agreement with a handshake beside a pair of graves. But the laughter felt good, felt like release and possibility. And as they rode back toward the ranch, Graham allowed himself to imagine what the next weeks might look like. Evelyn at the stove, learning to cook on a wood-burning range. Evelyn in the barn, helping with morning chores. Evelyn curled up by the fire at night, sketching or reading while he mended tack. The images came easily, naturally, as if some part of him had already accepted what his conscious mind was still fighting. They reached the house as afternoon shadows were lengthening across the snow. Graham unsaddled the horses while Evelyn explored the outbuildings, the chicken coop his mother had insisted on, the root cellar where he stored winter vegetables. When he found her, she was standing in what had been his mother's garden, now just a snow-covered plot marked by the fence posts his father had built. "The wildflowers," she said, gesturing at the buried ground. "They're under there, waiting for spring." "Yes." "Can I plant more? If I stay, I mean. Can I add to what your mother started?" The question hit him harder than it should have. The image of Evelyn continuing his mother's tradition, bringing color and beauty to this harsh place. "Yes," he managed. "I think she'd like that." Evelyn smiled and turned to face the mountains, the setting sun painting the peaks in shades of amber and rose. Graham came to stand beside her, and they watched the light fade together, neither speaking, both lost in their own thoughts about futures that might or might not come to pass. Finally, as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Evelyn spoke. "I should get back to town. Uncle Wallace will worry if I'm gone too long." "Stay for supper," Graham heard himself offer. "Nothing fancy, just beans and cornbread, but it would give you a sense of what an ordinary evening looks like here." She hesitated, and he could see the calculation in her eyes. Staying would mean riding back to Pine Creek in the dark, would mean further fuel for the town gossips, would mean crossing another invisible line in their tentative courtship. "All right," she finally said. "I'll stay for supper." They worked together in the small kitchen, Evelyn taking direction but adding her own touches, turning his sparse ingredients into something more substantial than he would have managed alone. And there it was, the domestic scene he'd been imagining, made real. Her presence transformed the space, made it feel less like a bachelor's cabin and more like a home. They ate at the rough wooden table his father had built, and Graham found himself talking more than he had in months, telling her stories about his childhood, his parents, the early years of running the ranch alone. And she shared her own stories, about growing up in Philadelphia society, about her mother's death and its aftermath, about the slow suffocation of living a life other people had planned for her. "I used to sketch secretly," she admitted, "hide my journals and pencils because my father thought art was frivolous, something to be enjoyed as a spectator, but never pursued seriously. When I finally showed him my work, hoping he'd see it as valuable, he offered to pay for lessons so I could develop some polish and be more interesting at parties. That must have hurt. It did. But it also showed me that staying in that world meant making myself smaller, dimming my own light to make others comfortable. And I couldn't do it anymore. Couldn't spend my whole life being decorative and deferential and dead inside." "Is that why you said yes when your uncle invited you west?" "Part of it. but also because I wanted to see if there was a version of myself I hadn't discovered yet, a version that existed outside the expectations and limitations of the world I grew up in. She met his eyes across the table. I think maybe I'm finding her here. Graham felt his throat tighten with emotion he couldn't quite name. I'm glad, he said simply, and meant it with every fiber of his being. After supper, they sat by the fire, the dishes washed and put away, the house settling around them with creaks and sighs. Evelyn had pulled out her journal and was sketching while Graham pretended to read but was actually watching her, mesmerized by the focused intensity on her face as her hand moved across the page. What are you drawing? She turned the journal so he could see. It was the kitchen, captured in quick, confident lines. The wood stove, the table, the window overlooking the darkening valley. But she'd added something that hadn't been there. Flowers in a jar on the table, bringing life and color to the sparse space. Wildflowers, she said, for spring. A reminder that winter doesn't last forever. He couldn't speak past the lump in his throat, so he just nodded, and she went back to her sketching, and they sat in comfortable silence until the fire burned low and the hour grew late. When it was time for her to leave, Graham saddled her horse in his own. I'm riding with you, he said, brooking no argument. You're not traveling alone after dark. They rode through the winter night toward Pine Creek, the stars brilliant overhead, their horses' breath fogging white in the cold. When they reached town, Graham accompanied her all the way to the hotel, helped her dismount, stood with her on the boardwalk in the lamplight. Thank you, she said, for today, for showing me everything, the beautiful and the hard, for trusting me enough to be honest. Thank you for not running when you saw what you'd really be choosing. She laughed softly. The day's not over yet. Give me time to process everything, and I might still come to my senses. If you do, I'll understand. I know you will. That's part of what makes this so hard. She reached up and touched his face, the gesture already familiar. You'd let me go without a fight, wouldn't you? If I decided this was too much, too hard, too impossible. Yes, he admitted, because keeping you here against your will, against your better judgment, would just be repeating my father's mistake. I won't do that to you. What if I want you to fight for me? What if I need to know that you want this badly enough to argue when I have doubts? The question caught him off guard. I don't know how to do both. Let you choose freely and fight for you to stay. They seem like opposite things. Maybe they are, or maybe the real skill is knowing which one is needed when. She smiled up at him. We're going to get this wrong sometimes, Graham. We're going to hurt each other and misunderstand each other and fail each other in ways we can't even anticipate yet. And we need to be okay with that. Need to promise we'll keep trying even when it's messy and difficult. I can promise that, he said. I can promise I'll try, even when I fail, even when I want to retreat into silence and self-protection. I'll keep trying. Then that's enough. For now, that's enough. She kissed him goodnight there on the hotel boardwalk, and Graham rode back to the Circle L with his heart full of hope and terror in equal measure. The next weeks would tell him whether this fragile, impossible thing between them could survive the test of time and reality. Whether love, if that's what this was, could take root deep enough to weather Montana's storms. He thought about his mother's wildflowers still coming back year after year despite the deer and the drought and the killing frosts. Thought about her refusal to let Montana make everything colorless, her insistence on beauty even when beauty seemed impossible. Maybe that was the lesson he'd been too blind to see. Not that loving in Montana was foolish or doomed, but that it required the same stubborn determination as everything else worth having in this harsh land. The willingness to plant beauty knowing it might not survive, but planting it anyway because the alternative was a world with no color at all. When he reached the ranch, the house felt different than it had that morning. Less like a tomb of memories and more like a place where the future might actually happen. He built up the fire and sat at the table with a cup of coffee, and in the flickering light he could almost see her there. Evelyn with her journal, her fierce determination, her refusal to settle for half-lived life. The next weeks would be hard, would test them both in ways neither could fully anticipate. But for the first time in 6 years, Graham Lark was willing to believe that maybe, just maybe, the hardest things were also the things most worth fighting for. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and silent, covering the world in white. But inside the Circle L ranch house, surrounded by his parents' memories and the ghost of a future not yet realized, Graham felt something he'd thought was lost forever. He felt hope. The days between Christmas and New Year's passed in a rhythm that felt both achingly slow and impossibly fast. Evelyn came to the Circle L each morning just after dawn, arriving with the first light and staying until the winter sun began its early descent toward the western peaks. Graham watched her learn the ranch with the same focused intensity she brought to everything, studying the cattle's behavior, mastering the intricacies of the wood stove, absorbing the 100 small skills that made the difference between comfort and misery in Montana winter. But it was the moments between the work that lodged themselves in Graham's memory with startling clarity. The way she laughed when one of the heifers butted her affectionately, nearly knocking her into the snow. The fierce concentration on her face as she learned to throw hay bales, her city-bred muscles adapting to ranch work with surprising speed. The quiet evenings by the fire when she'd sketch while he read aloud from his mother's books. Their voices filling the cabin with something that felt dangerously close to belonging. On the fourth day she arrived with news that made Graham's stomach clench with anxiety he couldn't quite suppress. "Uncle Wallace closed the deal on the timber tracts yesterday," she said, brushing snow from her coat as she entered the house. "He'll be heading back to Philadelphia in 3 days, the day after New Year's." Graham set down the coffee pot with careful precision, buying himself time to process what she'd just said. 3 days. 3 days and Wallace Hart would leave Pine Creek, and the question of whether Evelyn would leave with him would finally demand an answer. "That's good," he managed. "I mean, good for his business." "Graham." She crossed the room and took his hands, her touch warm despite the cold morning. "We need to talk about this. Really talk. Not dance around it the way we've been doing." "I know." "Do you? Because every time I try to bring up the future, you change the subject or find some urgent ranch task that needs attention." There was no accusation in her voice, just gentle insistence. "We have 3 days. 3 days to figure out if what we feel is real enough to build a life on, or if it's just the romance of shared danger and winter isolation." He wanted to protest that it was more than that, wanted to list all the ways she'd become essential to him in the space of a week. But doubt crept in, whispering questions he couldn't silence. How could you know someone in a week? How could feelings this intense be trusted when they'd been forged in crisis and uncertainty? As if reading his thoughts, Evelyn continued, "I've been thinking about what you said at your parents' graves, about needing time to learn how to trust again. And I realize we haven't had that time. We've had intensity and danger and these stolen hours, but we haven't had the mundane testing that really tells you if something will last. So what are you saying?" "I'm saying I need to know if this is real. If you're asking me to stay because you genuinely want to build a life with me, or because you're lonely and I'm convenient and the timing happened to align." She held his gaze unflinching. "And you need to know the same about me. If I'm staying for you, or if I'm running away from Philadelphia and you just happen to be here." The honesty of it felt like a punch to the chest, but Graham recognized the truth in her words. "How do we figure that out in 3 days?" "We stop being careful. We stop dancing around the hard questions and we ask them. We stop pretending this is a fairy tale and we treat it like the serious, life-altering decision it is." She squeezed his hands. "Starting now. Graham Lark, why do you want me to stay?" The directness of the question stripped away all his carefully prepared deflections. He could give her the romantic answer, tell her about how she'd awakened something in him he'd thought was dead, about how the world felt less harsh when she was in it. But she deserved more than romance. She deserved truth. "Because I'm tired," he said finally. "Bone tired of living half a life, of going through motions without purpose, of surviving without any reason to survive. You make me want more than that. Want to build something instead of just maintaining what's left. Want to believe the future might hold something besides more winters and more loss." He paused, forcing himself to continue. "But I'm also afraid that's not enough. That wanting something and being capable of sustaining it are two different things, and I've spent 6 years proving I'm good at survival but terrible at connection." "That's honest." She didn't look away, didn't flinch from his admission. "My turn. I want to stay because, for the first time in my adult life, I feel like I'm becoming myself instead of performing some version of myself that other people find acceptable. Montana strips away pretense. You strip away pretense. And what's left? The woman who throws hay bales badly and burns breakfast and asks too many questions. That woman feels more real than anyone I've been in Philadelphia. But I'm also afraid I'm romanticizing hardship, that I'm confusing the thrill of something new and challenging with genuine desire to make this my life. That 6 months from now, when the novelty wears off and it's just cold and hard and lonely, I'll resent you for not talking me out of it. They stood there in the morning light, hands joined, both their fears laid bare between them. It should have felt like an ending, like the moment where common sense prevailed and they acknowledged the impossibility of what they'd been considering. Instead, it felt like the first honest conversation they'd had, the first time they'd stopped performing and just been. "So what do we do?" Graham asked. "We test it. Today, right now, we stop being romantic, and we be practical. You tell me everything that's hard about this life, all the ways I'll struggle and fail and regret, and I'll tell you all the ways I'll make your life more complicated, all my flaws and failures and the baggage I'm bringing with me. And then, if we both still want this, we'll know it's real." Graham felt something between them shift, like they'd stepped onto more solid ground after weeks of walking on ice. "All right, let me start with winter." He spent the next hour painting an unflinching picture of Montana winters, the isolation that could go weeks without seeing another human face, the cold that could kill in minutes if you weren't careful, the darkness that set in by 4 in the afternoon and didn't lift until 8 in the morning. He told her about cabin fever, about the way silence could become oppressive, about the bone-deep exhaustion of fighting weather and wolves and equipment failure with no one to help and no guarantee of success. "Some winters we'll lose cattle," he said bluntly. "Animals I've raised from calves will freeze or starve or get taken by predators, and there won't be anything I can do about it. And the money they represent will be gone, which means tighter belts and harder choices. You'll go to bed hungry sometimes. You'll wear the same dress until it falls apart because we can't afford new fabric. You'll watch me work until I'm too exhausted to speak and know there's nothing you can do to make it easier." Evelyn listened without interrupting, her face serious but not frightened. When he finished, she nodded slowly. "My turn. I'm stubborn to the point of stupidity sometimes. I'll insist on doing things my way even when your way is better, because admitting I'm wrong feels like admitting weakness. I'll get frustrated with your silences and push for conversation when you need space, and then resent you for not opening up when I finally give you that space." She took a breath and continued. "I'm also afraid of medical things. Blood, broken bones, serious illness. They terrify me. If something happens to you, if you're hurt or sick, I might freeze instead of helping. And I'll hate myself for it, but the fear might be stronger than my determination to overcome it." "That's not a character flaw," Graham said gently. "That's human." "Maybe, but it's something you need to know. Out here, where the nearest doctor is 6 miles away and might not be able to come in bad weather, my fear could cost lives." She met his eyes. "I need you to understand that I might not be brave when it matters most, that the strength you've seen in me might fail at a critical moment." They continued like that through the morning, trading uncomfortable truths like cards in a high-stakes game. Graham told her about his temper, about how frustration sometimes made him say things he didn't mean and couldn't take back, about his tendency to withdraw when things got hard, to solve problems alone, even when partnership would be wiser, about the nightmares he still had about finding his father frozen in the snow, and how some mornings he woke up expecting everyone he cared about to be dead. Evelyn matched him truth for truth, admitting to her own darkness, the depression that sometimes swallowed her for days, making even simple tasks feel insurmountable. The way she sometimes compared people to her dead mother and found them wanting, including herself. The fear that she was fundamentally unlovable, that anyone who really knew her would eventually leave. By noon they were exhausted, wrung out from honesty, sitting at the kitchen table with cold coffee and the weight of everything they'd admitted hanging heavy between them. It should have driven them apart, this catalog of flaws and fears. Instead, Graham felt closer to her than he'd felt to anyone in years, because she'd seen the worst of him, really seen it, not the romantic notion of a brooding cowboy, but the broken reality of a man still learning how to be human, and she hadn't run.
I have one more question, Evelyn said finally, her voice quiet but steady. And I need you to answer honestly, even if you think the answer will hurt me. All right. Do you love me? Not the idea of me, not the possibility of what we could be, but me, flawed and fearful and stubborn, the actual woman sitting across from you right now? The question hung in the air like a challenge and a plea. Graham looked at her, really looked, taking in the tired circles under her eyes from too many early mornings, the calluses forming on her hands from ranch work, the way her hair was coming loose from its braid. She wasn't the polished Eastern lady who'd stepped off the stagecoach a week ago. She was rumpled and real and more beautiful than anything he'd ever seen. I don't know it, he said, and watched her flinch before he continued. I don't know if what I feel is love or need or just desperate hope that maybe I can have something good after years of loss. I don't trust my own emotions enough to label them confidently. But I know that when you're here, the world makes more sense. I know that I think about your happiness more than my own comfort. I know that the thought of you leaving makes me feel like I'm losing something essential, like a limb or a lung or some vital piece of myself. He reached across the table and took her hand. And I know that whatever this is, love or the beginning of love or something that hasn't been named yet, it's real enough that I'm willing to risk everything to find out where it leads. Is that enough for you? Can you build a life on, I don't know, but I'm willing to try? Tears tracked down her cheeks, but she was smiling. Yes, because that's my answer too. I don't know if I love you, Graham. I think I might, or I'm falling toward it, or I'm already there and too frightened to admit it. But I know that being here feels like breathing after years of suffocation. I know that working beside you feels like partnership in a way nothing in Philadelphia ever did. I know that when I imagine my future, you're in every version of it that doesn't feel like death. So what do we do with that? We take a leap of faith. She squeezed his hand. We stop waiting for certainty that will never come, and we choose each other anyway. We commit to trying, to failing, to getting back up and trying again. We build something real out of imperfect materials and hope it's strong enough to weather whatever storms come. Graham felt his chest tighten with emotion too large for words. You're sure? Because once you make this choice, once you stay, I'm going to hold on to you with everything I have. I'm going to fight for us even when it's hard, even when you have doubts, even when Montana makes you question everything. You need to be sure you want that kind of commitment from someone as broken as me. I'm sure. Her voice was steady, certain in a way that cut through all his remaining doubts. I'm choosing this. I'm choosing you. I'm choosing Montana and the Circle L and whatever future we can build together. Not because it's easy or safe or what I'm supposed to do, but because it's real. Because you're real. Because a hard life lived authentically is worth more than a comfortable life lived as someone else's idea of who I should be. They stood simultaneously, coming together in the middle of the kitchen with a force that spoke of desperation and relief and the terror of choosing uncertain happiness over safe misery. Graham kissed her like a drowning man finding air, and she responded with equal intensity, both of them pouring weeks of careful restraint into this moment of commitment. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Graham rested his forehead against hers. We should tell your uncle. Give him time to adjust to the idea before he leaves. He already knows. At Graham's surprised look, she smiled. I told him yesterday after he closed the timber deal. Told him I was staying in Montana, that I'd found something here worth more than anything waiting for me in Philadelphia. What did he say? He said he'd seen it coming since the day we rode back into Pine Creek after the avalanche. Said the way you looked at me and the way I looked at you told him everything he needed to know about where this was heading. She traced the line of his jaw with her fingers. He's happy for me, Graham. Worried, yes, because he understands what I'm choosing, but happy that I'm finally living for myself instead of performing for everyone else. Relief flooded through Graham, one more obstacle removed. When will you tell him you've decided? Made it official? New Year's Eve. There's a gathering at the hotel. Nothing fancy, just the townspeople marking the turning of the year. We'll tell him then, in front of witnesses, so it's real and binding and there's no taking it back in a moment of fear. That's 2 days away. I know. 2 days to finish testing this, to make absolutely certain we're not making a terrible mistake. She pulled back to look at him seriously. Graham, I need you to understand something.
When I commit to this, when I publicly choose to stay, there's no going back. My reputation in Philadelphia will be ruined. Respectable women don't run off to Montana with cowboys they barely know. My father will likely disown me. I'll be burning bridges that can't be rebuilt. I know, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be worth that sacrifice. Don't. Her voice was sharp, stopping him. Don't make it about being worthy or earning my choice or any of that romantic nonsense. I'm not a prize you won or a burden you're taking on. I'm a partner making the same leap you are, with the same risks and the same potential for failure. We're equals in this, Graham. We have to be, or it won't work. He'd never loved her more than in that moment, standing in his kitchen with her hair a mess and her eyes fierce with determination. Equals, he agreed. Partners. Whatever comes, we face it together. The next 2 days passed in a blur of preparation and nervous anticipation. Evelyn spent time with her uncle, helping him finalize business and pack for his return journey. Graham worked the ranch but found his thoughts constantly drifting to New Year's Eve, to the moment when their private understanding would become public commitment. The town would talk, he knew, would speculate and gossip, and probably place bets on how long an Eastern lady would last on a hardscrabble ranch. But for the first time in 6 years, Graham found he didn't care what people thought. Let them talk. He and Evelyn knew what they were building, and that was enough. New Year's Eve arrived with crystalline clarity, the kind of day that made Montana look like something from a storybook, all sparkling snow and blue sky, and mountains painted in shades of white and gray. Graham dressed carefully, wearing his good shirt and the jacket his mother had made him wear to church on Christmas when he was young. He felt foolish for caring about appearance, but tonight mattered. Tonight he was claiming a future, and he wanted to look like a man worthy of the chance. The hotel's dining room had been transformed for the occasion, tables pushed back to create space for dancing, lamps burning bright against the darkness, the smell of pine boughs and cider filling the air. The whole town seemed to have turned out, ranchers and shopkeepers, the sheriff and the preacher, families with children, and old-timers who'd seen Montana change from wilderness to territory to something approaching civilization. Graham arrived alone, his heart pounding harder than it had any right to. He accepted a cup of cider from Martha Foster, who winked at him knowingly, and positioned himself where he could watch the door. Waiting. Always waiting, it seemed, for Evelyn to walk into his life and transform it. Then there she was, entering with her uncle, and the room seemed to quiet around them. She was wearing a dress he hadn't seen before, deep green like the pine forests, simple but elegant, her hair pinned up to show the long line of her neck. She looked like she belonged in Philadelphia ballrooms, and for a moment Graham felt the old fear rise up. How could someone like her choose someone like him? How could this possibly work? But then her eyes found his across the room, and she smiled, and all his doubts dissolved. Because the way she looked at him, like he was the only person in the room, like he was worth crossing a continent for, like he was home, that look was real. That look was a choice, conscious and deliberate, and more precious than anything he'd ever been given. She crossed the room to him, her uncle following, and suddenly they were the center of attention, everyone watching to see what would happen next. Graham felt exposed, vulnerable, but Evelyn's hand found his and squeezed, and he drew strength from her touch. "Folks," Wallace Hart's voice carried across the room, commanding attention the way a lifetime in business had taught him. "I want to share some news with you all before I head back east tomorrow. My niece Evelyn has decided to stay in Montana. She's found something here worth more than what waits for her in Philadelphia." He paused, looking between Evelyn and Graham with approval and concern mingled. "She's found a future worth fighting for, and a man brave enough to build it with her." The room erupted in conversation, some approving, some skeptical, everyone having an opinion about the Eastern lady and the hermit rancher. But Graham barely heard it, because Evelyn was looking at him with tears in her eyes and a smile on her face. "It's done," she whispered. "No taking it back now." "Good," he said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. "Because I don't want to take it back. I want to move forward, with you, starting now." Sheriff Dawson stepped forward then, clearing his throat for attention. "Seems to me that if these two are making commitments, we ought to do it proper. Preacher Matthews is right here, and there's no better time than the start of a new year to start a new life. What do you say, Graham? You want to make this official?" Graham's mind reeled. He'd expected to have time, to plan a proper proposal, to do this right. But looking at Evelyn, at the hope and fear and determination in her eyes, he realized time and planning didn't matter. What mattered was the choice, the leap, the willingness to commit despite uncertainty. "Evelyn Hart," he said, loud enough for the whole room to hear, "I'm not going to make you pretty promises about how easy this will be. I'm not going to pretend I'm not terrified or flawed or still learning how to be human again, but I will promise to try, to choose you every morning and every night, to build something real with you, something worth the risks we're both taking. Will you marry me? Tonight, in front of these witnesses, so there's no backing out when we both come to our senses?" She laughed through tears, the sound bright and joyful. "Yes. Yes, absolutely yes. Let's be fools together and hope love makes us wise." Preacher Matthews came forward, his weathered face creased with a smile. "Well then, let's make it official before either of you changes your mind." What followed was the simplest, most profound ceremony Graham could have imagined. No elaborate vows, no lengthy sermon, just the essential promises to love and honor and cleave to one another, for better or worse, as long as they both lived. Graham's voice shook when he made his promises, but he meant every word with a fierceness that surprised him. And Evelyn's voice was clear and strong, choosing him in front of everyone, binding her life to his with words that felt like magic and covenant both. When Preacher Matthews pronounced them husband and wife, the room erupted in cheers and applause. Graham pulled Evelyn close and kissed her, tasting salt and cider and the promise of futures yet unwritten. When they pulled apart, she was smiling and crying and more beautiful than anything he'd ever seen. "What did we just do?" she whispered against his chest. "Something terrifying and necessary." He held her tighter. "Something our parents would probably call both brave and foolish." "Good. I'm tired of safe choices that make sense to everyone but me." They spent the rest of the evening accepting congratulations and well wishes, enduring teasing and advice from the townspeople who'd known Graham his whole life and were shocked to see him with a wife. Old Pete from the livery hugged Evelyn and told her she'd do fine. She had the look of someone with staying power. Martha Foster pressed a recipe book into her hands, whispering tips about cooking at high altitude. Sheriff Dawson clapped Graham on the shoulder and said it was about damn time he stopped brooding and started living. Through it all, Graham kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for reality to intrude and reveal this as the foolish mistake everyone would later claim they'd seen coming. But it didn't happen. Instead, as midnight approached and the new year drew near, he felt something he thought was lost forever settling into his chest. Peace. Contentment. The sense of having found something worth protecting instead of just surviving through. When midnight came, the room counted down together, voices rising in unison until the new year arrived with shouts and embraces, and the sound of pots being banged together outside. Graham turned to his wife, the words still strange and wonderful, and kissed her as 1885 became 1886, as their old lives ended and their new life began. "Happy New Year, Mrs. Lark," he murmured against her lips. "Happy New Year, husband," she replied, and he could hear the smile in her voice, the joy and terror and determination all mixed together. They left the celebration shortly after midnight, riding through the cold night toward the Circle L. Snow began falling as they traveled, soft flakes catching in Evelyn's hair and melting on her cheeks. When they reached the ranch, Graham helped her down from her horse, and they stood for a moment looking at the house, this place that was now their home instead of his solitary refuge. "It's not much," he said, suddenly nervous about what she must be thinking, comparing this rough cabin to the Philadelphia townhouse she'd left behind. "It's perfect," she said simply. "It's ours." They went inside together, Graham building up the fire while Evelyn explored with new eyes, seeing the space not as a visitor but as a resident. She touched his mother's books, examined the cooking implements, tested the chair by the fire. Graham watched her, still half expecting her to realize what she'd given up and break down in tears or recriminations. Instead, she turned to him with a smile. "Show me where you keep the coffee. I'm going to need to know these things if I'm going to be a proper ranch wife." "There's nothing proper about this," Graham said, crossing to her. "Nothing traditional or sensible or even remotely wise. We got married after knowing each other a week.
We're basing our entire future on feelings we can't name and faith we barely have. I know. She pulled him close, her arms wrapping around his waist. Isn't it wonderful? He laughed then, really laughed, and pulled her toward him for a kiss that tasted like snow and promise and the terrifying beauty of new beginnings. When they pulled apart, he rested his forehead against hers and spoke words he'd thought he'd never say again. I love you, Evelyn Lark. I don't know when it happened or how, but somewhere between the avalanche and the graves and your stubborn refusal to let me hide, I fell in love with you, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to deserve the choice you made. I love you too, she whispered back. And you already deserve it, Graham. You deserve happiness and partnership and someone who sees you clearly and loves you anyway. We both deserve this. We both deserve a chance at something real. They stood there in the firelight, two broken people who'd somehow found wholeness in each other, and Graham felt his mother's presence like a blessing. She would have loved Evelyn, he realized, would have seen in her the same strength and determination that had brought her west all those years ago, would have approved of this leap into uncertainty, this choice of hard authenticity over comfortable pretense. The winter stretched ahead of them, long and testing and full of challenges neither could fully anticipate. There would be hard days, Graham knew, days when the isolation felt crushing and the work felt endless and they'd both question whether this impossible gamble would pay off. Days when his silence would hurt her and her expectations would frustrate him, and they'd have to relearn how to be partners instead of just two people sharing space. But there would also be good days. Spring days when wildflowers would bloom around the house, continuing his mother's tradition and making it their own. Summer days spent working together, building the ranch into something sustainable and real. Fall days watching the aspens turn gold and feeling grateful for the harvest they'd brought in together. And winter days like this one, wrapped in each other's warmth while the Montana cold tested their walls and found them strong. Months later, as Graham had envisioned during those uncertain days before New Year's, wildflowers did bloom around the Circle L porch. Evelyn had ordered seeds from a catalog, had studied his mother's planting patterns, had added her own touches to create something that honored the past while embracing the future. Graham would come in from working the cattle and find her there, kneeling in the dirt with her hands in the soil, coaxing beauty from the harsh Montana ground. One evening in late May, when the world was green and gold and the winter's hardships felt distant, Graham stood on the porch watching her work. She'd taken to ranch life with the same fierce determination she brought to everything, mastering skills that had taken him years to learn, bringing efficiency and organization to aspects of the operation he'd been too stubborn to improve. She'd been right about the partnership. She wasn't decorative or delicate or any of the things he'd feared. She was strong and capable and more essential to the ranch's success than he could have imagined, more essential to his happiness than he'd dared to hope. She looked up and caught him watching, and her face transformed with a smile that still made his chest ache. "Come see," she called. "The lupines are finally blooming." He went to her, knelt beside her in the dirt, and looked at the purple flowers nodding in the evening breeze. "They're beautiful." "Your mother would have loved them," Evelyn said, leaning against his shoulder. "I wish I could have known her, could have thanked her for raising a son stubborn enough to survive and brave enough to love again." "She would have loved you," Graham said, pulling her close. "Would have seen what I was too blind to see at first, that strength comes in many forms, and sometimes the bravest thing is choosing an uncertain future over a safe past. Do you regret it?" The question was soft, vulnerable. "Choosing me? Letting me stay?" Graham thought about the past months, the hard days and the good ones, the arguments and the reconciliations, the slow building of something real and lasting. Thought about waking up each morning with Evelyn beside him, about the way the house felt like a home instead of a tomb, about the future that stretched ahead of them full of possibility instead of just more winters to survive. "Not for a second," he said, and meant it absolutely. "You made my Christmas wish come true, Evelyn, the one I didn't know I had. The wish for something worth living for instead of just surviving through." She turned in his arms and kissed him there among the wildflowers, and Graham felt the rightness of it settle into his bones. This was what his mother had tried to show him all those years ago, standing beside the frozen pond and insisting that even winter couldn't kill beauty. That love was worth the risk, worth the pain, worth the uncertainty, because without it,
Life was just an endless series of seasons to be endured rather than experienced. The wind swept through the valley then, carrying the scent of pine and wildflowers, and Graham held his wife close and watched the sun paint the mountains in shades of amber and rose. Montana was still harsh, still unforgiving, still testing them every day in ways large and small, but they were facing it together now, two people who'd been broken by loss and remade by love, building something that would last not despite the hardship, but because of it. Because the things worth having, Graham had learned, were the things you had to fight for. The things that demanded everything and gave back more than you'd ever imagined. The things that scared you and challenged you and made you better than you'd been alone. And Evelyn Hart, now Evelyn Lark, his wife, his partner, his Christmas miracle, was worth every risk, every fear, every leap of faith it had taken to find her. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, they went inside together, to the home they'd built and the life they were creating one day at a time. The future was uncertain, as futures always were, but they would face it together. And that, Graham knew, was more than enough. That was everything. The cowboy who'd wanted nothing for Christmas had gotten something far better than he'd dared to wish for. He'd gotten a second chance at happiness, a partner who saw him clearly and loved him anyway, and a future that held more than just survival. He'd gotten home, not a place, but a person. Not safety, but belonging. Not the absence of fear, but the courage to choose love despite it. And as snow began to fall again outside their window, soft and silent and eternal, Graham Lark smiled and pulled his wife close and gave thanks for the impossible gift of her presence. For the wildflowers that would bloom again next spring. For the life they were building together in this beautiful, brutal, magnificent place. For the Christmas wish that had come true when she'd ridden into town, and for every day since that he'd been brave enough to believe in second chances. Outside, Montana stretched vast and indifferent, winter giving way to spring, seasons turning as they always had and always would. But inside the Circle L ranch house, wrapped in firelight and love and the promise of tomorrow, two people who'd learned the hard way that survival wasn't enough were finally truly living, and that made all the difference.